Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. New Orleans wraps itself in its ghosts like a funeral veil. They linger in the thick, moisture-laden air, heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms and decay. They whisper from the ornate wrought iron balconies of the French Quarter and sway in the wavering glow of gaslights that cast long skeletal shadows onto the cobblestone streets. This is a city that nurtures its past, a place where joy and sorrow are two sides of the same worn coin, where life is embraced with frantic passion, as if each moment might be the last. In the summer of 2005, a new and terrible ghost was born. Hurricane Katrina did more than breach the levees. It shattered the city's soul. It left behind a landscape of catastrophic destruction, a drowned world of broken homes and silent streets. But within the heart of the storm's devastation, in the eerily still and deserted French Quarter, a strange and resilient form of life flickered. For the handful who chose to stay, the disaster became a crucible, forging a new existence in the furnace of shared survival. Among these people were Zachary Bowen and Addie Hall, two souls who found in the chaos a fleeting paradise, a romance written in the calm eye of the hurricane. Their story would become one of New Orleans' most infamous legends, a deep-fried love affair that began with a defiant will to live and ended in an act of unspeakable horror. Zach Bowen was a man full of contradictions. A California native, he carried the easy charm and laid-back demeanor of a sun-bleached beach wanderer. He was strikingly handsome, with long blonde hair and a disarming smile capable of putting strangers at ease and winning hearts. But beneath this exterior lived a man haunted by inner demons he could neither name nor escape. He'd married young to a woman named Lana and fathered 2 children. To provide for his family, he enlisted in the military in May 2000, seeking the structure and benefits it promised. His service took him to the war-torn landscapes of Kosovo and Iraq, where he worked as a military policeman. He witnessed things no person should experience. He was deeply affected by the sudden death of a fellow soldier and haunted by the memory of a young Iraqi child he befriended, a boy killed simply for speaking with troops. The horrors of war embedded themselves deep in his psyche, inflicting wounds that were invisible but profound. He received commendations for his service, a decorated soldier on paper, but he returned to civilian life as a broken man, struggling with a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder that went undiagnosed and untreated. The military had given him medals, but it had taken a piece of his soul. His marriage fell apart, leaving him adrift in New Orleans, taking odd jobs in French Quarter bars. His past was a constant weight dragging him down. Adrienne Addie Hall was a whirlwind of energy, a poet, artist, and performer. She embodied an untamed spirit with a volatile temperament and fierce independence. She traveled to New Orleans from the Northeast searching for a place where her artistic nature could thrive. She found it in the French Quarter, an area she embraced so completely that she identified as a quarterite. She was a familiar figure pedaling her bicycle along the narrow streets to her bartending job at the Spotted Cat. Her presence was a vivid burst of color against the neighborhood's aged patina. But Addie also battled personal demons. Her background was scarred by violent relationships that had left her wary around men. She struggled with bipolar disorder, a turbulent internal ocean she navigated with medication she often failed to take, resulting in unpredictable bouts of rage. Her life was a precarious balance, a fight to harmonize her creative dreams with the firm grip of her mental struggles and addictions. They met as many in the quarter do, across a bar. Both were tending drinks, moving through the nighttime world of clinking glasses and easy conversation. Addie, guarded by her experiences, initially engaged Zach with teasing harshness, a test to gauge his character. He felt drawn to her spirited nature. She was attracted to his gentle charm. A connection developed between them early on, but it proved stormy from the start. A potent mixture composed partly of genuine affection, partly of fierce arguments, partly of mutual dependence on substances numbing comfort, including drugs and alcohol alike. These were two wounded people who recognized in each other imperfect mirrors, reflecting themselves. When warnings about Hurricane Katrina began echoing through town, Zach originally planned to leave. His ex-wife Lana extended an invitation, allowing Addie to come along. But Addie valued autonomy highly. Declining to abandon either her home or her adopted city, Zach visited to ensure her safety, hoping to convince her to evacuate. Instead, he found himself unable to desert her. Determined to weather the storm together, their choice permanently intertwined their destinies. While Katrina unleashed its rage, submerging the city in darkness and pandemonium, Zach and Addie discovered an unlikely refuge inside their flat. The cataclysm peeled back modern civilization, exposing raw romance and barrenness. In the weeks that followed, the French Quarter became their personal kingdom. They, along with a few remaining residents, formed a tight-knit, self-reliant community. They cooked food over open fires in the street, drank lukewarm beer from coolers, and raised their voices in song beneath a night sky, now brilliantly starlit, no longer dimmed by the city's usual electric lights. They ruled as monarchs of the quarter. Their love story amid the wreckage captivated the national press. They were featured in magazine spreads and newspaper articles, their images becoming symbols of New Orleans' indomitable spirit. They were swept up in the magic of it all, unaware of the real catastrophe unfolding just streets away, at the Superdome, and in the flooded neighborhoods where thousands were suffering. For a brief, dreamlike period, they experienced euphoria. Their love was forged in the crucible of shared disaster. But when the calamity subsided, the floodwaters receded, electricity was restored, and the slow, demanding work of reconstruction began. The return of routine hit like a brutal wake-up call for Zach and Addie. The street fires were extinguished, bills accumulated, and the responsibilities of their former lives came back with force. The enchantment born from their joint survival faded, exposing the grim reality of their troubled relationship. The city's gradual, agonizing recovery mirrored the deterioration of their love. Zach, already bearing emotional wounds from Iraq, was profoundly shaken by Katrina's aftermath. The presence of military vehicles on patrol and the immense scope of destruction triggered his PTSD beyond his control. The euphoric rush from their Katrina experience vanished, and they sought another in the familiar destructive refuge of substance abuse. Their fights increased in frequency and intensity. Physical and emotional abuse escalated as their fantasies shattered. In a last-ditch effort to revive the lost passion, they decided to make a fresh start. They found a rental unit on Rampart Street, a historic Creole-style building with rooms above the Voodoo Spiritual Temple, a prominent cultural landmark run by priestess Miriam Chamani. Using saved tips, they covered the deposit and moved in, clinging to hope that new surroundings could repair their broken bond. This hope was short-lived. Almost immediately after settling in, an irreparable rift emerged. Addie, doubting Zach's fidelity, approached their landlord. In a final act of betrayal, she requested that only her name be on the lease, giving her sole power to evict him. The landlord drafted a handwritten agreement, hoping they would reconcile. But upon discovering her deception, something within Zach fractured beyond repair. The man, already teetering on a mental precipice, was pushed over entirely. His charm, his smile, his laid-back demeanor vanished completely, revealing the rage and despair that had been brewing underneath. The climax came late into the night. At approximately 1:00 a.m. on Thursday, October 5th, 2006, in their small apartment above the Voodoo Temple, the arguments and fury culminated in horror. In a cold state of wrathful calm, on their futon mattress, he strangled Addie Hall to death. It happened quickly, as he later described himself. Afterward, in a drunken, sorrowful stupor, he slept beside her corpse. Perhaps too exhausted emotionally and physically after such violence had erupted from him like some internal tempest, finally unleashing its full destructive force. What followed was even more disturbing. Over the next 12 days, Zach Bowen remained in the apartment with Addie's body. He dismembered her corpse, cooking some of her remains in pots on the stove. He stored her body parts in the refrigerator, a grotesque, methodical disposal of the woman he'd claimed to love. He continued his daily routine, going to work at the bar, returning each night to the apartment that had become a tomb. The psychological horror of those days, the complete disconnect from reality, speaks to the profound mental breakdown Zach was experiencing. He was a man utterly lost, living in a nightmare of his own making. On the night of Tuesday, October 17th, 2006, almost 2 weeks after Addie's murder, Zach Bowen climbed to the rooftop bar of the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel. He had a final drink, paced anxiously for a short time, and then committed his ultimate violent act. He jumped. His body came to rest on top of a parking structure 7 floors below. Officers arriving at the scene found the body of the 28-year-old. In his pocket, they found a folded note sealed in plastic. Also inside the bag were his military dog tags and a key. The message was addressed only to the police. It began with an eerily straightforward confession. "This is not an accident. I had to take my own life to pay for the one I took. If you send a patrol car to 826 North Rampart, you will find my girlfriend Addie's dismembered body in the refrigerator and a full signed confession from me, Zach Bowen." The letter directed investigators to the home above the Voodoo Temple. The first thing they noticed upon entry was the cold. The air conditioning was running at full blast, set to 60 degrees. A desperate and surprisingly successful attempt to mask the smell of decomposition. The living space was cluttered with sealed moving boxes, evidence of a life that would never come to pass. Then they noticed the walls marked with silver spray paint. Zach had written his final eerie messages. "I love her," said one. "I'm a total failure," declared another. And then the most dreadful instruction. An arrow pointing toward the kitchen. What the seasoned detectives found next would stay with them forever. They opened the heavy refrigerator door. They found Addie Hall. The sight matched exactly what Zach's note had described, a grotesque and carefully arranged display of death. Inside the apartment, they also found Addie's journal. Zach had used its final pages to write a more detailed account of his actions and his mental state. His words portrayed a man disturbed not by the killing itself, but by his own alarming lack of guilt. "Today is Monday, October 16th, 2:00 a.m., he wrote. "I killed her at 1:00 a.m. On Thursday, October 5th, I very calmly strangled her. It was very quick. What scared me was not calmly choking the woman I've loved for 18 months, and then violating her body afterward, but my complete lack of remorse. I've always known what a piece of shit I am. Ask anyone. I decided to quit my job and use the $1,500 in cash. I had to enjoy myself until I took my own life. So that's what I did, and had a great time living out my final days. It's almost time now." The story of Zach and Addie became a public fascination, a modern Southern Gothic horror tale that both captivated and horrified the nation. It was a chronicle of love and death in a city associated with both. Some looked for supernatural explanations, attributing the tragedy to the dark voodoo energies of their dwelling place. But the reality was much more mundane and much more sad. It was a tragic convergence of untreated mental conditions. Zach's PTSD and Addie's bipolar disorder, worsened by drug use, and lingering trauma from a city devastated by a hurricane. Zach Bowen wasn't a demon spawned by voodoo curses. He was a casualty of a war he couldn't escape and support systems that didn't reach him in time. In his suicide letter, he documented having 28 cigarette burns on his body, one for each year he lived, to symbolize his failures in education, career, service, marriage, fatherhood, ethics, love. He was someone drowning in his own despair, and he dragged down with him the woman he cherished. The tragedy's darkness extended further in one final grim coincidence. A close friend of theirs, Margaret Sanchez, who had publicly mourned for them, would later be convicted in connection with Jaron Lockhart's death and dismemberment in 2012, a Bourbon Street entertainer. The crime bore unsettling similarities. Another life abruptly ended, another body dismembered. It seemed as though the violence that overwhelmed Zach and Addie had spread like a disease. Currently, the unit at 826 North Rampart Street features on ghost tours. Its horrific past is merchandise for thrill-seeking tourists. But the real horror of this story lies not in spectral activity but in the stark reality of two dynamic, tormented souls, wrecked by external and internal storms. They were kings and queens of the French Quarter, symbols of hope in a devastated city. Ultimately, they succumbed to inner demons. Story 2. In the quiet, modest neighborhood of Deer Park, Texas, in the fall of 1974, Ronald Clark O'Brien epitomized American decency. At 30 years old, he worked as an optician, served as a deacon in his Baptist church, directed the church choir, and was a devoted family man. He lived with his wife Daynene and their two beautiful children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, in a humble house that represented the ideal suburban life. To neighbors and church members, Ronald O'Brien was a pillar of the community, a friendly, upstanding man always ready with a smile and a helping hand. But beneath this calm, carefully crafted exterior, a different truth was brewing. Ronald O'Brien was a man drowning in debt. Over the past decade, he'd been hired and fired from 21 different jobs, a pattern of unreliability that pointed to a deeper personal failing. By the fall of 1974, he stood on the edge of financial ruin. He owed upward of $100,000, a sum equivalent to over $500,000 in today's currency. His car was about to be repossessed, and his home faced imminent foreclosure. The pressure was crushing, a vice that was squeezing the life from his carefully maintained facade. Ronald O'Brien was a desperate man, and desperate men, as he would soon demonstrate, can commit the most heinous acts. In the months before Halloween, a strange and sinister new obsession had taken hold in O'Brien's mind: cyanide. He began asking questions, at first casually, then increasingly insistent. He questioned a chemist acquaintance about the poison, asking how much would be fatal. He approached a salesman from a chemical supply company to find out where he could buy it. At the community college where he was taking classes, he peppered his instructor with questions about the relative lethality of different poisons. He even tried to purchase cyanide from 2 separate chemical supply shops, leaving empty-handed only because the minimum quantity available exceeded his budget or his needs. At the same time, O'Brien was quietly and systematically taking out life insurance policies on his children. In January, he'd secured policies for Timothy and Elizabeth worth $10,000 each. Then, just 1 month before Halloween, he obtained additional $20,000 policies on both of them. He disclosed none of this to his wife, Daynene. A plan was forming in the shadowed recesses of his mind, a terrible answer to his financial troubles. He was preparing to make a sacrifice, not at the altar of his faith, but at that of greed. Halloween night in 1974 fell on a Thursday. The air in Deer Park was warm and thick, with the smell of burning leaves. and the excited voices of children. Ronald O'Brien, dressed in his ordinary clothes, escorted Timothy and Elizabeth on their trick-or-treating rounds. They were joined by a neighbor, Jim Bates, and his two kids, Mark and Kimberly. The small group moved along the familiar decorated streets of their neighborhood as their plastic jack-o'-lanterns and pillowcases slowly filled with candy. As night wore on, they approached a house on a corner. The lights were off. The porch looked dark and unwelcoming. Jim Bates and the children moved on down the block, seeing no activity there. But Ronald O'Brien stayed behind in the darkness, briefly before rejoining them moments later, carrying an unusual bounty. 5 enormous 22-inch pixie sticks, powdered candy enclosed in long plastic tubes. He claimed they'd been given to him by residents who slightly cracked open their door during candy distribution. An odd story dismissed amid the festive Halloween commotion without further thought by anyone present at that moment. After returning home later that night and preparing for bed, tired from the evening's excitement, young Timothy requested permission for one last piece of candy before sleeping. Standing nearby, his father guided him toward those large candy straws specifically, instead of allowing any other treat. Timothy sat bedside, tearing open the top and pouring the sweet-colored contents into his mouth. He immediately complained about the bitter taste, prompting his dad to bring Kool-Aid to counteract the flavor. Shortly after, Timothy stumbled to the bathroom, the onset of violent retching and convulsions, excruciating suffering. The ambulance arrival proved futile. He was pronounced dead upon hospital admission, under an hour after consumption. The idyllic suburban existence shattered into an unthinkable horror scenario, unfolding throughout Deer Park, spreading alarm across the peaceful locality. A child's death due to poisoned holiday candy, actualizing grim folklore, every parent's ultimate dread come true. Law enforcement was immediately notified about the 4 additional oversized pixie sticks that Ronald O'Brien had handed out. A desperate late-night search began. The first stop was the Bates home. Awakened by officers, Jim Bates found the 2 pixie sticks his kids had received, both still sealed. Next, authorities contacted the household of 10-year-old Whitney Parker. His parents found him asleep in bed, clutching the pixie sticks. He tried to open one, but the staples securing the plastic tube's top proved too tough for his small hands. He'd given up and drifted off to sleep. That small, frustrating detail had saved his life. The last pixie sticks was at the O'Brien home, intended for 5-year-old Elizabeth. She hadn't eaten it. All 4 remaining straws were rushed to a laboratory for testing. The results were alarming. The top 2 inches of each straw contained not candy but potassium cyanide, a quantity lethal enough to kill 2 adults per straw. The candy powder had been carefully layered over the poison, and the plastic straws had been resealed with a staple. This was no accident. It was premeditated, calculated murder. The police investigation began with one urgent question. Who was the deranged poisoner? The faceless monster who dispensed death from a darkened house. The entire neighborhood was gripped by fear. Throughout the Houston area, parents were told to surrender all candy their children had collected. A massive, unprecedented recall driven by citywide hysteria unfolded. Law enforcement faced enormous pressure to catch the culprit. Their focus quickly turned to Ronald O'Brien, the man who distributed the candy. He alone had encountered the mysterious resident of the dark house. The investigation, led by Pasadena Police Detective Mike Hinton, depended on O'Brien's story. They asked him to retrace his steps and lead them to the house where he got the tainted candy. For several days, O'Brien seemed to suffer from a conveniently frustrating memory lapse. He couldn't remember which house it was. Finally, after persistent questioning by investigators, his memory was jogged. He pointed to a corner house belonging to Courtney Melvin, an air traffic controller at Houston's Hobby Airport. Convinced they had their suspect, police swarmed the airport and arrested Melvin in front of his coworkers. The mystery seemed solved, but it wasn't. Courtney Melvin had an ironclad alibi. On Halloween night, he'd been at work until 11 p.m., verified by numerous colleagues and official records. His wife and child had been home but turned off the lights early after running out of candy and didn't answer the door for anyone. Ronald O'Brien's story was false, a realization that sent a chill down the investigators' spines. Only he could have put the poison into the candy before handing it out. The investigation's focus shifted with grim certainty toward the grieving father himself. As detectives dug into Ronald O'Brien's background, his carefully crafted image as an upstanding family man began to crumble. They uncovered overwhelming debt, 21 failed jobs, an impending car repossession, and then they discovered the life insurance policies. A call to the insurance company revealed a chilling detail. At 90 a.m., just hours after his son's death, and before an autopsy had been performed, Ronald O'Brien had called to ask about claiming Timothy's policy. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were falling into place. On November 5th, 1974, only 5 days after Timothy's death, detectives executed a search warrant at the O'Brien home and found scissors with plastic residue matching pixie sticks material on the blades. In a drawer lay a slip of paper and adding machine tape where O'Brien had precisely calculated his debts, totaling nearly identical amounts to those insured on his children's lives. Though circumstantial, the evidence painted a damning portrait: motive, greed, means, access to cyanide, later corroborated by testimonies from his professor and a chemical salesman. Opportunity, sole handler before distribution. That same day, Ronald Clark O'Brien was formally charged with 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The mad poisoner from urban legend wasn't some unknown stranger, but their own father. Ronald Clark O'Brien's trial, beginning May 5, 1975, in Houston, captivated national media. Dubbed the Candyman, a sinister nickname forever linked with his atrocity, he maintained innocence throughout proceedings. Represented by famed defense attorney Marvin Teague, he built his case upon the same urban legend his actions had horrifically realized. The idea of a faceless, random monster contaminating Halloween treats. But the case against him, led by the compelling prosecutor Vic Driscoll, systematically dismantled his defense. They laid out before the jurors an overwhelming mountain of circumstantial evidence. The financial debts, the life insurance policies, the questions about cyanide, the lie about the corner house. Friends and colleagues testified about O'Brien's strange fascination with cyanide in the months before the killing. The most impactful testimony came from his wife, Daninda. Appearing pale and withdrawn, she testified and told the courtroom she'd had no knowledge of the life insurance policies her husband had taken out on their children. She described his odd lack of grief after Timothy's death, how he'd punched the wall and asked why an 8-year-old had to die. Yet she'd seen not one tear from him. She also contradicted a crucial element of his story, stating that it was Ronald who'd insisted on giving Timothy the candy straw, not the other way around. The prosecution's closing argument was a brilliant display of moral outrage. Vic Driscoll, pointing at the defendant, declared his whole life has been a lie. He exploited his church community. He exploited his friends. He exploited his neighborhood and his family. And most egregiously, he exploited his son. Unlike Abraham, he sacrificed his child on the altar of greed. On June 3rd, 1975, after a trial, they returned after only 46 minutes. The verdict was guilty on all charges. A little over an hour later, they announced the sentence: death by lethal injection. Soon after the conviction, Danine O'Brien filed for divorce. She would eventually remarry, and her new husband legally adopted her daughter Elizabeth, giving her a fresh name and a chance at a life freed from the shadow of the father who tried to kill her. Ronald O'Brien was sent to death row, where he would remain for the next 9 years, fighting his sentence. On the night of his execution, March 31, 1984. A large, angry crowd gathered outside the prison in Huntsville, Texas. They shouted "trick or treat" and pelted the building with candy as a final bitter condemnation of the man who'd corrupted a beloved childhood tradition. Inside, O'Brien's final words were marked by stubborn and misguided devotion. "What is about to happen here is wrong," he said. "However, we as human beings must answer for our actions. I will be forgiven for this." His last utterance was a plea for divine mercy for everyone present. He was pronounced dead at 12:48 a.m. The crime committed by Ronald Clark O'Brien did more than just end his own son's life. It poisoned a society. He gave horrifying real form to an enduring myth. In doing so, he transformed how an entire generation of parents viewed Halloween. The open and trusting practice of trick-or-treating was permanently changed, replaced by a new norm of X-rayed candy, trunk-or-treat events in church parking lots, and a persistent undercurrent of fear. The Candyman had vanished, but the ghost of his crime would haunt the holiday for years to come, a chilling testament to when a father's greed transformed a child's sweet delight into a lethal weapon of murder. Story 3. In the refined, sun-drenched world of Beverly Hills, California, the surname Menendez in the summer of 1989 represented the glittering, ruthless possibility of the American dream. The family occupied a sprawling Spanish-style mansion on Elm Drive, a palm tree-lined boulevard of understated wealth, far removed from the grittiness and hustle of ordinary life. At the head of this domain was Jose Menendez, a 45-year-old Cuban immigrant who'd fought his way up from poverty to the heights of corporate success. He was a self-made man, a driven, exacting, and often harsh executive at Live Entertainment, a company specializing in home video distribution. His wife, Mary Louise, known as Kitty to everyone, was a former beauty queen, a delicate, often unhappy woman who'd sacrificed her own ambitions to support her husband's relentless rise. Their two sons, Joseph Lyle, 21st, and Eric Galen, 18, were the designated heirs to this luxurious dynasty. They were handsome, privileged young men who'd been given every advantage: expensive educations, elite tennis coaching, and the expectation of a future secured by wealth. Lyle was the older, more confident brother, enrolled at Princeton University. Eric was the younger one, more sensitive and introspective of the two, a talented tennis player with dreams of going professional. To outsiders, they embodied a perfect, powerful family, the living proof of Jose's hard-earned success. But beyond the manicured hedges and gated entrances of the Elm Drive mansion lay a different truth. The home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker of impossible expectations, emotional distance, and a dark, destructive secret. Jose was a tyrant, a father who ruled his sons with iron control. His love came with conditions. His approval was a prize perpetually out of reach. Kitty, trapped in a troubled marriage and prone to bouts of depression, often served as a distant and ineffective buffer between her husband's domineering personality and her son's growing resentment. The perfect family was a complete fiction, a carefully crafted illusion on the verge of being destroyed in a hail of shotgun fire and a flood of blood. On a warm August evening, the tension that had been building for years would finally erupt in catastrophe. Sunday, August 20th, 1989, unfolded as a quiet night on Elm Drive. Jose and Kitty Menendez had settled in for the evening in their mansion's den, watching television. Between them sat a bowl of ice cream topped with strawberries. Outside, the air was still and mild. At 11:47 p.m., the peace was shattered by an urgent and panicked 911 call. The voice belonged to Lyle Menendez. He was screaming and sobbing, his words coming out in choked waves of fear that were nearly unintelligible. "Somebody killed my parents," he wailed. "My mom and dad have been shot." The first officers to arrive at the scene encountered an image of almost inconceivable horror. The den, a room meant for relaxation and family time, had become a slaughterhouse. Jose Menendez lay on the floor, his body riddled with multiple shotgun blasts. One close-range shot to his head had nearly obliterated his features. Kitty Menendez rested on the couch, her body brutally disfigured by 10 gunshot wounds, as she apparently tried to escape the initial volley. The room was drenched in blood, its air heavy with death's metallic smell. It was an execution, an act so ferocious and unrestrained it suggested profound personal hatred. Lyle and Eric, the two sons who discovered this sight, were outside on the lawn, appearing overwhelmed by grief. They told law enforcement that they'd been at a movie screening followed by the Taste of a food festival before coming home late to find this carnage. They suggested that their father, a man with formidable enemies, had fallen victim to an organized crime-style hit. In those early hours after the discovery, this story seemed plausible enough. Investigators from the Beverly Hills Police Department, confronted with such intense brutality, began probing into Jose's complex, often contentious professional dealings, examining former colleagues, legal disputes, whispers about ties to criminal syndicates. For some time afterward, both brothers were regarded not as persons of suspicion, but rather as pitiful orphan victims left behind after an unspeakable tragedy. But as days stretched into weeks, detectives started noticing something odd. The grief displayed by these siblings appeared notably short-lived. In the months after the killings, Lyle and Eric embarked on a grand, conspicuous spending spree, buying Rolex watches, designer clothes, luxury cars, including a Porsche for Eric. They purchased a restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey. They traveled, partied, and lived the lives of young men who'd suddenly inherited immense, undeserved wealth. Their spending approached $700,000 total, an unmistakable warning sign. Investigators grew more suspicious upon learning the pair had hired a tech specialist to delete a recently revised copy of their father's will stored on his computer. A document that would have excluded them from the inherit. The possibility of a gangland execution was looking increasingly unlikely. The investigation's focus was shifting with a sickening inevitability toward the two sons, who seemed to be celebrating their parents' deaths instead of mourning them. But suspicion didn't equal evidence. The detectives lacked any physical proof, no eyewitnesses, and no murder weapon. The investigation had reached a frustrating impasse, a puzzle missing a crucial piece. That crucial piece, they would soon discover, was hidden in the private files of a Beverly Hills psychologist. A secret on the verge of being exposed by a resentful, spurned lover. The turning point in the case came not from forensic science, but from the anguished psyche of the younger brother, Eric. In the months after the killings, his behavior had grown increasingly unstable. The weight of his terrible secret was crushing him. In October 1989, he entered the office of his therapist, Dr. Jerome Ogiel, and confessed. Over several emotional recorded sessions, he revealed the entire story. He and Lyle had meticulously planned and executed their parents' murders. Eric told Dr. Ogiel that they'd killed their father because of his domineering nature. They wanted freedom from his tyrannical rule. They'd killed their mother, he explained, because she was a miserable, emotionally volatile alcoholic, and it was an act of mercy. This confession was a shocking and explosive disclosure, a straightforward acknowledgement of guilt from one of the perpetrators. But this admission was protected by the sacred confidentiality of the therapeutic relationship. Dr. Ogiel was forbidden from reporting it to law enforcement. However, there was another person involved in this psychological drama, Dr. Ogiel's mistress, a woman named Judilon Smith. In an act of remarkably poor professional and personal judgment, Dr. Ogiel had allowed Smythe to eavesdrop on the taped confession sessions. She became the keeper of a secret she should never have been privy to, a secret that gave her dangerous power over both Dr. Ogiel and the Menendez brothers. When her own affair with Dr. Ozio began to deteriorate, she decided to wield that power. In March 1990, 7 months after the murders, Judalon Smythe approached the Beverly Hills police and revealed everything she'd heard. Her account and the revelation of the tapes provided the breakthrough investigators had long awaited. Lyle was arrested soon after. Eric, who was in Israel for a tennis tournament, returned to the United States and turned himself in. Both brothers were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, charges that made them eligible for the death penalty. Their arrests initiated a long and complex legal battle over the admissibility of the confession tapes. The defense argued that the tapes were protected by therapist-patient confidentiality. The prosecution maintained that this privilege was voided because Lyle had threatened Dr. Ozio and because the confession had occurred with a third party present, Judalon Smythe. After a series of appeals that reached the California Supreme Court, a compromise was reached. The court ruled that portions of the tapes could be presented to a jury. This set the stage for a trial that would become one of America's most sensational and polarizing legal proceedings. A trial that would expose the dark rot beneath an outwardly perfect family. The first Menendez brothers trial, beginning in July 1993, was a watershed moment in American legal history. It was among the first trials to be broadcast live on the emerging cable network Court TV, transforming a tragic family saga into a nationwide spectacle. The proceedings took place in one courtroom, but featured 2 separate juries, one for each brother, a legal strategy designed to address the complexities of their individual defenses. At the heart of their defense was a sharp, passionate attorney named Leslie Abramson, a woman with an unwavering commitment to her clients' causes. She'd earned fame as a tenacious advocate who fought relentlessly for those she represented. In this case, she devised an innovative yet controversial defense strategy. Rather than claiming innocence for her clients, she argued they committed parricide out of necessity, an instance of imperfect self-defense stemming from prolonged, severe over years, endured over years. Both Eric and Lyle testified tearfully, offering harrowing accounts of a childhood filled with torment. They described their father, Jose, not as a successful businessman, but as a depraved predator who'd sexually assaulted them since youth. They portrayed their mother, Kitty, as an erratic, substance-dependent alcoholic, aware of the abuse yet a passive enabler of her husband's atrocities. The defense maintained that on the night of the murders, the brothers acted out of genuine, imminent fear for their lives, claiming their father had threatened to kill them to prevent exposure of his dark secrets. Abramson argued that the killings weren't driven by greed, but were a desperate preemptive action taken by 2 frightened young men who saw no alternative. This wasn't a case of murder, she declared. It was a case of manslaughter, a legally defensible killing, albeit a tragic one. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanich, offered a completely opposite account. They claimed that the allegations of abuse were a recent, calculated invention, a last-minute attempt to justify an inexcusable act. They highlighted that the abuse claims only surfaced after the brothers had been arrested and were facing the death penalty. They called upon witnesses, including friends and relatives, who testified that they'd never seen any signs of abuse and that the Menendez family outwardly seemed happy, accomplished, and loving. The prosecution emphasized greed as the motive. They detailed the brothers' extravagant spending in the months after the murders, depicting them as ruthless killers celebrating their newly acquired freedom and wealth. They also focused on the sheer, raw brutality of the crime itself, the multiple shotgun blasts, the close-range shot to Jose's head. This wasn't the act of 2 scared teenagers defending themselves, they argued. It was the work of 2 people filled with profound and enduring hatred. A hatred that culminated in an act of almost unimaginable violence. After 6 months of testimony, the case was handed to the 2 juries. The nation watched with bated breath. And then came the astonishing outcome. In January 1994, Both juries declared they were hopelessly deadlocked. The jurors were divided, torn between the competing narratives of greed and abuse. The result was a mistrial for both brothers. For a brief moment it seemed they might escape justice, but the prosecution, undeterred, announced their plan to retry the case. The second trial for Lyle and Eric Menendez, beginning in August 1995, was markedly different. Cameras were banned. A new judge presided. And most importantly, there was just one jury. Judge Stanley M. Weisberg, known as a strict jurist, made several rulings that greatly restricted the defense's ability to present their story of abuse. He ruled that the jury couldn't consider the defense of imperfect self-defense, effectively dismantling the core argument that had caused the first mistrial. Without the emotional impact of the abuse defense, the prosecution's case, which had always been strong on the factual details of the crime, became overwhelming. Attention shifted back to the brutality of the murders, the financial motive, and the brothers' own confession. The prosecution team, now headed by Deputy District Attorney David Kahn, relentlessly emphasized that this was a straightforward, merciless murder for monetary gain. After a trial far less sensational yet equally consequential as the first, the jury retired into deliberation. This time, they reached consensus. On March 20th, 1996, the verdict was returned. Guilty verdicts against both Lyle and Eric Menendez, each convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, jurors recommended life imprisonment without parole, sparing them the death penalty. The sentence was formally imposed on July 2nd of the same year, sentencing them to consecutive terms, ensuring they'd remain incarcerated until death. They were separated into different facilities, breaking their tight, interdependent relationship. Over the next 20 years, they remained confined within California's prison system, fading from public attention. Appeals were consistently rejected, but the story surrounding the Menendez brothers, along with the issues it raised regarding abuse, trauma, and justice, never entirely disappeared. Recently, it's experienced a remarkable, unexpected revival. A new generation growing up amid the social media era, plus increased cultural awareness of the complexities surrounding trauma and abuse, began reassessing the case. Many, particularly younger people, began embracing the siblings, viewing them not as ruthless murderers, but as tragic survivors of a dreadful childhood. This perspective aligned more closely with Leslie Abramson's initial defense than the prosecution's victorious argument. This cultural shift, coupled with new legal developments, created ideal conditions. In May 2023, their appellate lawyers filed a habeas corpus petition, a legal strategy aimed at overturning their convictions by presenting alleged new evidence. This included a letter Eric wrote to a cousin back in 1988, months before the killings, where he hinted at ongoing paternal abuse, writing, "It's still happening, and every night I stay up thinking he might come in." The petition ended up with then Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon, a progressive prosecutor committed to reviewing older, potentially unjust sentences. In October 2024, a surprising development came when his office suggested the brothers should be resentenced. The resentencing hearing was delayed, and when it eventually occurred, a different, more conservative district attorney, Nathan Hochman, had taken office. Hochman strongly opposed the resentencing, dismissing the brothers' allegations of abuse as fabrications. But the legal momentum was unstoppable. On May 13, 2025, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Michael Jezik, following an emotional proceeding that featured testimony from relatives, issued a groundbreaking decision. He sentenced Lyle and Eric Menendez to a term of 50 years to life, which made them immediately eligible for parole. Having spent nearly 30 years behind bars, the Menendez brothers now faced the prospect of release for the first time. The final chapter of this long and sorrowful story is yet to be written. In August 2025, Eric's first parole application was denied, with the parole board citing his unacceptable risk to public safety due to prior infractions while in prison. Uninterrupted. Lyle's parole hearing is still pending. The siblings, who were reunited in the same prison in 2018, continue their wait. The legal saga of Lyle and Eric Menendez remains one of America's most complex, polarizing, and enduring criminal stories. It's a tale that defies simplicity, fundamentally centered on two conflicting and irreconcilable truths. Were they two spoiled, greedy young men who murdered their parents for financial gain? Or were they two broken, frightened children who killed their abusive tormentors in a desperate bid to survive? The legal system has rendered its judgment, but public opinion remains deeply divided. The Menendez brothers' case transcends a mere criminal chronicle. It stands as a dark American saga, a tragedy that persistently reflects our continuously shifting perceptions of justice, trauma, and the terrible hidden realities that can lurk behind even the most perfect facade. Story 4. On the evening of September 2nd, 2015, Dallas was wrapped in the familiar oppressive heat of a Texas summer's end. For Dr. Kendra Hatcher, the day had been a rewarding blur of small victories. As a children's dentist, her life was filled with gap-toothed smiles and the quiet satisfaction of easing young fears. At 35, she had built a life that felt full and purposeful. Raised in Illinois with a foundation of strong Christian values, her compassion extended far beyond her work. It was who she was. She'd traveled on mission trips to build churches and organized Bible classes for children in need. Her journey had taken her from DePauw University to the University of Kentucky College of Dentistry, eventually landing her a coveted position at Smile Zone in Dallas, where she provided top-tier dental care to underserved children. Her world had recently grown even brighter. Several months earlier, she'd met Dr. Ricardo Ricky Paniagua, a dermatologist, through an online dating site. What started as messages soon blossomed into something deep. Ricky, who'd moved to Dallas to complete his residency after a divorce, found in Kendra a kindness and authenticity that felt like coming home. Their relationship moved at a pace that surprised them both, marked by easy laughter and the quiet certainty of a shared future. They were already talking about marriage. A trip to Cancun was booked. A quick getaway to celebrate their love was set to begin the very next day. As Kendra guided her car into the Gables Park 17 parking garage, a multi-story concrete structure attached to her upscale apartment complex. Her mind was likely filled with last-minute travel preparations and the feel of warm sand beneath her feet. She navigated the familiar turns, climbing toward her assigned spot. The air in the garage hung still and heavy, carrying the scent of concrete and exhaust fumes. It was a threshold space, a brief pause between the vibrant outside world and the sanctuary of her home. She eased into her parking spot. The engine went quiet, and in that sudden silence, her future, so clearly imagined just moments before, was extinguished. A shadow emerged from the darkness, a flash of light, a deafening crack, and one fatal gunshot wound. Kendra Hatcher, a woman of deep faith and boundless compassion, was gone before her head slumped against the steering wheel. Early reports suggested a robbery gone tragically wrong, a sad but not entirely uncommon occurrence in a major city. But the truth was far more sinister, born not from random violence, but from calculated, poisonous obsession. The architect of this evil was someone Kendra had never met, Brenda Delgado Reynaga. Brenda's story, like Kendra's, was one of ambition. Born in Mexico on June 18, 1982, she was brought to Dallas as an infant by her father, Louis, who sought a better life for his wife and 5 children. Brenda, the only daughter among them, grew up under the weight and promise of the American dream. She was described as driven, constantly striving to prove herself. After high school, she became a dental assistant, later taking on extra work doing teeth whitening at a spa to supplement her income. By most accounts, she worked hard toward her goals. Her life changed forever when she met Ricky Paniagua on a dating app. He was finishing his residency at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, a handsome, accomplished doctor on an upward trajectory. For nearly 3 years, they were a couple. In Brenda's mind, this was the life she'd been working toward. But their relationship was less stable than she portrayed. They broke up during the summer of 2014, only to reconcile briefly from November 2014 until February 2015, when Ricky ended it for good. For Ricky, the breakup was final. For Brenda, it was just an obstacle to overcome. She couldn't, or wouldn't, accept that the future she'd envisioned with him was over. While Ricky thought of them as friends who texted occasionally, Brenda clung to the belief they would reunite. She kept a key to his apartment and, without his knowledge, had his email and iCloud passwords. His digital life became her private obsession. She lived as an invisible presence in his virtual world, an unseen observer of his every move. In the spring of 2015, her surveillance uncovered a new threat, Kendra Hatcher. As Ricky's relationship with Kendra deepened, Brenda's obsession curdled into something cold and methodical, a focused rage. From the hidden vantage of his accounts, she watched their romance unfold. She screenshot their text conversations, their dinner plans, their flight reservations for the Cancun trip. Every photo of them smiling, every tender message was another wound. Kendra was living the life Brenda believed should be hers. She was an obstacle that needed to be removed. The term love triangle would later be used to describe the situation. But that label was wrong. A triangle implies all parties know of each other's existence. Kendra Hatcher had no idea Brenda Delgado even existed. She was busy planning a vacation and building her future, completely unaware of the woman who was tracking her every movement with obsessive precision, plotting her destruction. Brenda's hunger for revenge began to crystallize into a concrete plan. At the time, she was studying to become a dental hygienist, but this dark enterprise became her new focus. She dropped out of her program at Sanford Brown College to dedicate herself fully to the mission of destroying Kendra Hatcher. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help. She needed accomplices, people she could manipulate and control. Her first choice was Crystal Cortez, a young single mother. Brenda began cultivating a relationship with Cortez, taking her out to meals and presenting herself as a mentor and confidante. Gradually, she broached the subject, framing it as a problem she needed help solving. She told Cortez about her wealthy ex-boyfriend and the new woman standing in the way of her happiness. Before long, their vague conversations evolved into a specific proposition. $500 for Cortez to serve as the getaway driver in a plot to kill Kendra Hatcher. A tempting offer for someone struggling financially, coming from a woman who seemed confident and connected. But they needed a third person, someone to pull the trigger. Through her connections, Brenda found Christopher Love, a low-level drug dealer with a criminal history. To him, she projected a different image, not just a scorned lover, but a woman with powerful ties. She dangled the prospect of not just a one-time payment, but ongoing drug supply and advancement in the narcotics trade through her supposed cartel connections. Love, perhaps seeing it as a chance to move up in the underworld, agreed. The price for Kendra Hatcher's life was set, $500 for the driver, and roughly $3,000 in cash and drugs for the shooter. With her team in place, Brenda's surveillance intensified. She and Cortez began physically stalking Kendra's movements. They used binoculars to watch Kendra from afar at her dental practice, studying her routines from a distance. Each day, they gathered more intelligence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The turning point seemed to come on August 3rd, 2015, when Ricky informed Brenda by email that he was removing her from his phone plan, a final practical step severing their last formal tie. To Brenda, This mundane action felt like an act of war. The plan shifted into active execution. They chose September 2nd for the deed, the day before Kendra and Ricky were scheduled to leave for Cancun. The choice was deliberately symbolic and cruel. Brenda wanted to destroy not just Kendra, but the happiness she represented. That day, Brenda carefully constructed an alibi. She had Cortez drop her at a library, a quiet setting perfect for someone appearing innocent. She'd also borrowed a distinctive black Jeep Cherokee from an acquaintance to use as the getaway vehicle. Their initial plan was to ambush Kendra as she left work, but they missed their opportunity due to a change in her schedule. Undeterred, they moved to their backup location, the parking garage at her apartment complex. They followed her there, Cortez driving the Jeep with love-riding shotgun, armed and ready. Cortez slipped through the security gate by tailgating another vehicle into the garage. They positioned themselves in hiding until Kendra Hatcher pulled into her spot. Then they made their move. Christopher Love stepped out of the Jeep with his face concealed, approached her car, fired a single shot into her head, and grabbed some of her belongings to stage a robbery before returning to the Jeep as Crystal Cortez sped away from the scene. Minutes later, a neighbor discovered Kendra's body. In the immediate aftermath, the Dallas Police Department treated it as a homicide during a robbery. But the calculated nature of the killing and untouched valuables soon raised questions. This wasn't random. It was personal. The first major break came from the getaway vehicle. Surveillance footage from the garage captured the black Jeep Cherokee. Police released images of it shortly afterward, which prompted Jose Luis Ortiz to come forward. He revealed he'd lent his Jeep to his friend Brenda Delgado that fateful day. Suddenly, Brenda Delgado went from being seen as just an ex-girlfriend on the sidelines to someone under serious scrutiny. Investigators brought her in for questioning. Her interrogation footage, later shown at trial, painted an unsettling picture, a composed, deceptive demeanor throughout the questioning. She remained calm and cooperative, expressing shock and sorrow upon hearing about Kendra's death. When asked where she'd been the night of the murder, she confidently produced a restaurant receipt, claiming she'd been dining and studying, providing what seemed like a solid alibi. She denied any involvement, temporarily convincing detectives they'd been looking in the wrong direction. She was briefly held on an unrelated outstanding parking ticket, but after paying the fine, she was released. As Brenda walked free, the investigation was rapidly closing in on her accomplices. Authorities recovered the murder weapon and traced it to Christopher Love, leading to his arrest. Shortly after, they apprehended Crystal Cortez. Her story began to crumble under interrogation. At first, she gave conflicting versions of events, but eventually, faced with the evidence stacked against her, she broke. She told investigators everything. She laid out how Brenda Delgado, driven by venomous jealousy, had orchestrated the entire scheme. She described the stalking, the promises of payment, and the cold calculation. She admitted to being the getaway driver and identified Christopher Love as the shooter. Cortez's confession became the key piece. It provided a clear motive and a complete narrative that tied everything together. But even with this detailed confession, the evidence against Brenda was circumstantial. She hadn't been at the crime scene. No physical evidence directly linked her to the garage. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of a self-admitted co-conspirator. As Brenda realized her elaborate web of lies was unraveling, and that Cortez had turned on her, she made a desperate move. She ran. Anticipating an imminent arrest warrant, she fled across the border into Mexico, becoming a fugitive. The hunt for Brenda Delgado expanded from national to international scope. The Dallas Police Department worked with the FBI to launch a widespread manhunt. In April 2016, 7 months after the murder, the FBI made the notable decision to add Brenda Delgado to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to her capture. She became only the 9th woman to be featured on this notorious list since its creation in 1950. Thomas M. Class Senioren, the special agent in charge of the FBI's Dallas field office, emphasized that even though she didn't pull the trigger, she bore full responsibility. He declared that Brenda Delgado masterfully manipulated everyone involved in her calculated plot. While she didn't personally fire the shot, she was accountable for the killing. The strategy worked. Just 2 days after her image was broadcast worldwide as one of America's most wanted criminals, Brenda Delgado was caught. On April 8, 2016, following a tip, officials from the Mexican Attorney General's office found her at a home in Torreon, Coahuila. She was taken into custody without incident. The international fugitive who had engineered a brutal murder was finally behind bars. However, her capture in Mexico presented a major challenge for the legal system. Under Mexican law, extradition is not allowed to countries where a fugitive might face the death penalty. To bring Brenda Delgado back to Texas for trial, the Dallas County District Attorney's Office had to make a difficult decision: agree not to seek the death penalty. They agreed. In October 2016, Brenda was extradited back to the United States to face a capital murder charge with a maximum sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. The legal proceedings unfolded over the following years. Christopher Love, who pulled the trigger, went to trial first in October 2018, with Crystal Cortez testifying against him. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He remains on death row in Texas. Crystal Cortez, in exchange for her crucial testimony against both Love and Delgado, pleaded guilty to murder and received a 35-year prison sentence. Finally, in June 2019, it was Brenda Delgado's turn to face a jury. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Kevin Brooks, laid out her overwhelming obsession. They presented evidence of her stalking, her access to Ricky's accounts, her use of tracking software, and the binoculars she used for surveillance. They called Ricky Paniagua as a witness, who described their relationship history and his quick, intense connection with Kendra. The star witness, though, was Crystal Cortez. She gave the jury a chilling, direct account of Brenda's manipulation. She wanted to kill Kendra Hatcher out of jealousy, Cortez stated, maintaining her composure. She described how Brenda had instructed her on procedures and behavior, how she had orchestrated every detail of the crime, from securing the vehicle to crafting her own alibi. Brenda's defense attorneys argued that the prosecution built its case on emotion rather than solid evidence, pointing to the use of graphic crime scene photos and testimony from an unreliable accomplice testifying for self-preservation. They claimed the investigation focused on Brenda based on detective intuition, not concrete proof. But the evidence, though circumstantial, painted an incriminating and consistent picture. The jury watched footage of Brenda, composed and deliberate during questioning. They learned about her flight to Mexico. They heard Cortez's detailed and coherent description of the plot. The state argued that Brenda was a master manipulator who saw people simply as tools to achieve her goals. On June 7, 2019, after a week of testimony, the trial went to the jury. They needed just 20 minutes to reach a verdict. Brenda Delgado was found guilty of capital murder. The proceedings quickly moved to the punishment phase, which included victim impact statements. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered grief and rage. Kendra Hatcher's mother, Bonnie Jameson, locked eyes with the woman who had stolen her daughter's future. "You, Brenda Delgado, have secured your place in this world behind prison bars for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life," she said, her voice shaking with anger and sorrow. "And if the law could have given you the death penalty, believe me, I would have been leading the charge." Kendra's sister spoke next, crying openly as she addressed Delgado directly. "Brenda, you are disgusting. What gives you the right? I hope you suffer for eternity." Brenda Delgado was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was transported to the William P. Hobby Unit, a women's correctional facility in Marlin, Texas. where she will spend the rest of her days. The legal case was closed, but the devastation it caused remains. It's a chilling story of how love, when twisted by obsession and jealousy, can turn into the deepest and most destructive form of hatred. Kendra Hatcher, a woman who dedicated her life to bringing joy to others, fell victim to a scheme driven by a soul that had lost all capacity for feeling except rage, leaving a void no verdict could ever fill. Story 5. In the spring of 2019, the London borough of Richmond-upon-Thames was a picture of quintessential English charm. It's an area of manicured gardens, riverside pubs, and the sweeping green expanse of Kew Gardens, a part of the city that feels worlds away from its bustling heart. On a quiet, tree-lined street in Kew, in a ground-floor flat, lived Laureline Garcia Berteau. At 34, she was a woman bursting with creative energy, a French national from Aix-en-Provence who had made London her home and her canvas. Laureline's life was a rich tapestry woven with threads of passion and ambition. She was a talented filmmaker and producer, a rising star in the independent film scene. She'd recently worked with a legendary actress on a short film called Gary, an achievement that filled her with pride. She was also a skilled blogger, a dog lover, and someone with a wide, devoted circle of friends drawn to her warmth and vibrant spirit. Her days were marked by constant motion, an endless pursuit of the next creative project or adventure. But beneath this bright creative surface, a shadow lingered, a source of instability and financial worry that created a persistent undercurrent of anxiety in her world. That shadow was her ex-boyfriend, Kirill Belorusov. He was a 32-year-old Estonian, a good-looking and charismatic man who worked in bars and nightclubs, carrying himself with the confidence of someone destined for bigger things. He claimed to be a stuntman, boasting about roles in major Hollywood films like World War Z's, a lie as audacious as it was easy to disprove. Their romance had been long and intense, spanning 8 years before ending 2 years earlier in 2017. But the ties between them hadn't been completely severed. Belorusov, whose life was chaotic due to financial recklessness, owed Laureline a substantial amount, thousands of pounds she'd lent him in trust. For months, she'd been trying to get it back, a frustrating and fruitless effort. Belorusov excelled at evasion and spinning elaborate lies. He told Laureline and others that he had cancer, a cruel fabrication designed to gain sympathy, and crucially, buy time to avoid repaying his debts. By early 2019, another burden was weighing heavily on Laureline. The lease on her Kew flat was ending, forcing her to search for new accommodation. It was during this period of vulnerability, caught between housing and financial instability, that Kirill Belorusov reappeared in her life. Not as a debtor, but as a savior. He approached her with a perfect solution, an offer that seemed too good to be true. He told her he'd found a new place for her, a beautiful house he would help her secure. It was a grand gesture that seemed like a selfless act from someone who still cared about her and wanted to make amends. He promised to help with her move and assured her that this fresh start would mark the beginning of better times. Laureline, trusting and hopeful, believed him. She couldn't have known that the house he promised was built on lies, a phantom dwelling within a carefully constructed illusion. She couldn't have known that the man offering to help her move was actually planning to move her from life into death. The final days of Laureline Garcia Berteau's life were filled with excited preparations. The new home promised by Kirill stood as a beacon of hope, representing renewal. She began the laborious process of packing up her life, carefully wrapping her belongings as her living space gradually transformed into a maze of boxes and packing tape. By all accounts, she was happy. But as the scheduled moving day approached, strange, unsettling messages started coming from Laureline's phone. Her friends, accustomed to regular, candid exchanges, began receiving texts that felt off. The tone was slightly wrong. The phrasing wasn't typical of her. On Saturday, March 2nd, Beth Penman, one of Laureline's closest friends, got a message saying Laureline was meeting up with a handsome veterinarian she'd recently encountered. To Beth, this seemed unlikely. It didn't sound like her friend, who wouldn't typically go on impromptu dates, especially during such a stressful period. The oddities continued. On Sunday, March 3rd, the day she was supposed to move, another friend received several texts. "I am so happy right now," one read, followed by another mentioning her new landlord was quite eccentric, and she wanted to shop for breast implants. The messages were a strange mix of euphoric excitement and bizarre, incongruous details. They were crafted to paint the picture of a woman starting fresh amid mild chaos. But they were fake. Laureline Garcia Berteau had already been murdered. The texts were sent by her killer, a heartless, deceptive act designed to buy him time. The sender, Kirill Belorusov, was meanwhile busy with a different kind of errand. On that same Sunday, surveillance footage from a local hardware store in London captured him moving through the aisles with a detached, methodical purpose. He purchased an axe, a pack of heavy-duty garbage bags, and a set of plastic shoe covers. The tools for concealing evidence, the uniform of someone preparing to dispose of a body. By Monday, March 4th, the facade began to crack. Laureline didn't show up for her job as an executive assistant at the PR firm Gullin. Her co-workers grew concerned. It was completely unlike her to miss work without notice. Her friends, their worry escalating with each unanswered message, began to mobilize. By Tuesday, March 5th, that worry had swelled into full alarm. Beth Penman, her heart pounding with a terrible certainty that something was wrong, contacted authorities to file a missing persons report for her friend. The police response was swift. Officers were dispatched to the small ground floor flat in Kew. They knocked, but got no answer. Gaining entry through a back door, they found a scene that appeared normal yet deeply disturbing. The apartment was stacked with moving boxes, evidence of a life being packed away. The two large dogs Laureline adored were there, but unusually subdued, their normally playful energy replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. But there was no sign of Laureline herself. The investigation began. Officers moved through the tidy, organized flat, examining every corner for signs of struggle or any clue that might reveal her whereabouts. Their attention then turned to the small garden behind the home. It was there, in a flower bed, that an officer noticed a patch of freshly disturbed soil. A chill of dread settled over the scene. They began to dig. It didn't take long before they found the truth. Just beneath the surface of rich, dark earth, they discovered her. Laureline Garcia Berteau was buried in a shallow grave. Her naked body was bound and wrapped in black plastic trash bags, the same type he'd been seen purchasing at the hardware store. The search for the missing woman had ended. The hunt for her murderer had just begun. The discovery of Laureline's body transformed the case from a missing persons investigation to an intensive murder inquiry. An autopsy was performed, and the cause of death was determined with stark clarity. Laureline had been killed by ligature strangulation. The ligature used to take her life was still fastened around her neck. The investigation, led by Detective Chief Inspector Simon Harding of the Metropolitan Police, quickly focused on the man who had been central to Laureline's life during her final days, Kirill Belorusov. But by the time law enforcement identified him as their prime suspect, he had already vanished. On Monday, March 4th, the day Laureline failed to show up for work, and one day before her body was discovered, Belorusov had caught a bus and fled the country, beginning a frantic journey across Europe back to his native Estonia. He left behind damning evidence in his wake. Text messages sent from Laureline's phone after her death were an obvious and callous ploy to create an alibi, suggesting she'd left voluntarily. The CCTV footage from the local store was a silent, black and white record of a killer preparing to hide his crime. And there was even more. compelling evidence to come. Forensic examination of the ligature recovered from Laureline's neck detected a tiny amount of DNA that matched Kirill Belorussov perfectly. Police now had a clear and terrifying theory of the crime. Belorussov, heavily in debt to Laureline and under mounting pressure to pay what he owed, had devised a heinous and elaborate lie. He fabricated stories of a new home, a new beginning, and an offer of help. He lured her into a state of trusting vulnerability before killing her sometime over the weekend of March 2nd and 3rd. The prosecution would later argue that his motive was as simple as it was wicked. He killed her to erase his debt. With their suspect now on the run abroad, the Metropolitan Police launched an international search. Working with Europol, they tracked Belorussov's movements until March 13, 2019, just over a week after Laureline's body was found, when he was arrested by police in Tallinn, Estonia's capital. He was taken into custody under a European arrest warrant designed for his swift return to Britain for trial. Upon his arrest, Belorussov, a master of deception, put on one last performance. He proclaimed his innocence and told Estonian authorities he wanted investigations to clear his name quickly. A futile and desperate plea from someone who knew justice was closing in. As the son of a former Estonian police officer, he requested expedited extradition proceedings. By late March, he'd been flown back under guard, marking an end to any freedom he had left. Everything was now in place for proceedings that would fully expose just how deep his deception ran. Story 6. In the late spring of 2005, the historic market town of Richmond in North Yorkshire, England, was the picture of rural tranquility. Situated on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, it's a town of cobbled streets, a Norman castle looming over the River Swale, and a peaceful, settled way of life that feels removed from the hurried pace of modern society. Within a modest family home lived 19-year-old Jenny Nicol. To those who knew her, Jenny was a young woman standing at the threshold of her future. Someone with a deep love for music, a talent for performing on guitar in local pubs, and a job at the local supermarket that anchored her artistic pursuits in the regularity of everyday life. Jenny was the daughter of Anne and Brian Nicol, her father having been a member of the British Army. The family had made Richmond their home after her older sibling enlisted and was stationed at the nearby Catterick garrison. By all accounts, she was an ordinary teenager navigating the intricate dynamics of peer relationships, family ties, and first ventures into adult life. But beneath this commonplace country existence, a dark and secret connection had formed. A relationship that had begun years earlier in secrecy and was poised to climax in an act of violence so complete and a deception so heartless that it would shatter a family and haunt the town for years to come. On the night of Thursday, June 30th, 2005, the Nicol household hummed with the muted, customary atmosphere of a family preparing for the weekend. Jenny told her parents she planned to stay overnight with friends, a typical arrangement for someone her age. She gathered some personal items, things suggesting an outdoor trip, a small bag, spare clothes, her cell phone. At 6:00 p.m., she stepped out through the front door of her family's house, a casual goodbye echoing as she left. It was the last time her parents would see her. The first days after her disappearance didn't immediately raise major concern. Jenny was a young adult with an independent life and her own social circle. It was plausible she'd extended her camping trip or gotten caught up in the carefree freedom of a summer break. But as time went by without any contact, no phone call or text, a chilling thread of anxiety began to wind around her mother's heart. This wasn't like Jenny. She kept close ties with her family. She would have been in touch. By Monday, July 4th, that anxiety had erupted into overwhelming dread. Brian Nicol went to the North Yorkshire Police to file a missing persons report for their daughter. Their fear intensified upon finding her car, A white Rover 214, left unattended in the parking lot of Richmond's Holly Hill pub. It stood as a grim, silent clue that something was terribly wrong. A young woman on a camping trip doesn't abandon her vehicle. One who's simply run away doesn't discard her method of transportation. The police investigation began with meticulous efforts to piece together the last known movements of the missing woman. They interviewed Jenny's friends and coworkers, anyone who might have seen her or had information about her whereabouts. As they probed her into her life, one name surfaced from obscurity. A name initially whispered in gossip and suspicion, but that would rapidly become the ominous focal point of the entire investigation. David Hodgson. At 45 years old, David Hodgson was a married father of 2 children who outwardly appeared as an upstanding community member. His daughters had attended school with Jenny, but he harbored a hidden truth, a secret he'd kept for half a decade. He'd been in an illicit relationship with Jenny Nickel, beginning when she was just 14 years old. He'd been grooming her through a gradual, persistent predatory process that led to sexual involvement once she reached 16. Investigators quickly identified him as a key suspect. 9 days after Jenny's disappearance was reported, authorities brought Hodgson in for questioning. He displayed a calm, composed denial. He refuted having an affair with Jenny. He claimed ignorance about where she might be. He insisted he played no role in her disappearance. Legally speaking, at that moment, he seemed just another interviewee among many. He walked free without any charges. Then came what appeared like a miracle. Jenny's mobile phone, which had been silent for over a week, suddenly activated, sending out several text messages. These communications seemed supportive of the police theory that perhaps she'd simply taken off voluntarily. The messages sent to family and friends talked about a fresh start, a new chapter. They formed electronic breadcrumbs suggesting a different possibility from the grim scenario of murder, pointing instead toward the brighter idea of teenage rebellion. The texts originated from distant locations away from Richmond, Carlisle in Cumbria, Jedburgh and the Scottish borders. For Ann Nickel, the texts were a lifeline. She clung to the belief that her daughter was safe and sound, that she just needed to get away. She traveled to both Carlisle and Jedburgh, a mother on a frantic quest, searching for a phantom in unfamiliar city streets, her heart beating like an anxious, hopeful drum in her chest. But for the detectives, the messages aroused increasing doubt. They seemed too convenient, too neat. They didn't feel right. As summer wore on and the initial hope from the text messages gave way to a returning and deepening silence, law enforcement began to view the case with fresh skepticism. In November 2005, they issued a public statement that would crush the last remnants of the family's hope. The investigation, they declared, had shifted from a missing persons case to a murder inquiry. The search for Jenny Nickel had ended. The hunt for her killer was now underway, with the investigation pivoting from finding a missing person to tracking a murderer. Attention turned back with renewed intensity to David Hodgson, the man who'd denied all accusations, whose life was a carefully crafted image of respectability, was about to have that image torn down, exposing the dark, obsessed, and violent truth beneath. At the end of July 2005, just weeks after Jenny's disappearance, authorities found David Hodgson in a remote, dilapidated cabin near Hudswell Village. He'd taken an excessive mix of pills and alcohol, a dramatic suicide attempt that investigators interpreted as a clear sign of a guilty conscience. He survived, but this incident only amplified the cloud of suspicion gathering around him. In later police interviews, his story began to shift. He admitted that he and Jenny had been romantically involved, but claimed, in a desperate attempt to minimize his role, that the relationship had ended a year earlier. This was a lie, one of many that would eventually lead to his downfall. Detectives dug deeper into the complicated, toxic dynamics that defined Jenny's final days. They uncovered another layer of deception, another hidden truth that added a powerful motive to the case. In the weeks before she went missing, Jenny had started seeing someone new. The person she was dating was Robert Hodgson, David Hodgson's older brother. Robert appeared to be unaware of his brother's long affair with Jenny. It was a love triangle of the most twisted and dangerous kind, a scenario that prosecutors would later argue drove David Hodgson, described as deeply jealous, to his breaking point. The police search expanded to include more than 150 locations, even septic tanks, and involved soldiers from the nearby Cataract Garrison. It eventually focused on a specific spot, Sandbeck Plantation's remote woodland area. It was there, in crude hidden shelters built by the Hodgson brothers, where investigators found the first poignant physical traces of Jenny's final moments: her nightgown, her cherished teddy bear, and her cassette player. Most critically, DNA evidence emerged directly refuting David Hodgson's claim that he hadn't visited those shelters with Jenny. However, despite this accumulating web of circumstantial evidence building against him, a conviction remained uncertain. There was no body, no crime scene, no conclusive proof that Jenny was dead, much less that David Hodgson was responsible. The text messages, while suspicious, still presented powerful counter-evidence. A digital ghost persistently suggesting she was alive. It was then that the investigation took an innovative, ultimately pivotal step. Authorities enlisted an expert in forensic linguistics, an emerging scientific field that subjects texts not just to content analysis, but to style, grammar, syntax, their very linguistic essence. Comparing the post-disappearance message styles against samples from Jenny's earlier writings yielded clear, definitive results. The sender wasn't Jenny Nicole. The linguistic signatures didn't match. The prosecution gained a formidable new tool. They argued the messages were calculated, deceptive acts by someone who knew Jenny was dead, aiming to mislead the investigation. Their theory explained how the deceit was executed. Evidence showed David Hodgson rented a vehicle between July 9th and July 14th, 2005. The mileage logged during those days matched almost precisely the round-trip distances from Richmond to Carlisle and Richmond to Jedburgh. The car rental dates aligned exactly with the message dispatch dates. The deception was carefully orchestrated. A deceptive journey undertaken with a dead girl's phone as his only companion. The investigation had become a complex, elaborate puzzle. A nobody homicide that required proof through an intricate network of circumstantial evidence. But this network was strong and increasingly tightening around a single person. In May 2007, almost 2 years after Jenny's disappearance, law enforcement made their move. David Hodgson was formally charged with murdering Jenny Nicole and was held in custody, his long covert battle against reality about to be exposed to the unforgiving scrutiny of a courtroom. The trial of David Hodgson, beginning at Teesside Crown Court in January 2008, was a testament to the power of circumstantial evidence. Without a body, a murder weapon, or a confession, the prosecution team, led by James Goss Q, meticulously built their case piece by piece, lie by lie, creating a structure of guilt so formidable it would eliminate all reasonable doubt. They told the jury a story of secret, obsessive love, depicting a man who'd groomed a teenage girl and was consumed by lethal jealousy when she redirected her affections toward his brother. The prosecution argued that on the evening of June 30th, 2005, David Hodgson had ended Jenny Nicole's life and then destroyed her remains with deliberate, premeditated determination to ensure they stayed hidden forever. They presented DNA evidence from the shelter in Sandbeck Plantation, physical proof that Hodgson had lied about his presence there with Jenny. They submitted car rental documents with odometer readings serving as silent numerical corroboration of his deceptive journeys. They also presented the groundbreaking and compelling testimony of a forensic linguist who confirmed with scientific precision that the text messages, which had cruelly misled Jenny's family with false hope, were not written by her. Faced with this overwhelming accumulation of proof, the defense tried to sow doubt. They called David Hodgson's older daughter to testify. She claimed to have seen Jenny alive in Richmond 2 days after her disappearance, and said that Jenny had been living with Robert Hodgson. This was a desperate final attempt to shift blame toward the brother, the new romantic interest. But Robert Hodgson, when taking the stand, forcefully denied this claim, insisting he hadn't seen Jenny for a long time. The defense also sought to undermine the reputation of Jenny's own family, portraying her father Brian as violent and suggesting that Jenny had fled home to escape him. This was a heartless and baseless accusation, which the judge later noted was made without any supporting evidence whatsoever. For Ann and Brian Nichol, forced to endure this slander of their family in court, the trial was an unprecedented and agonizing ordeal. David Hodgson continued to proclaim his innocence, his expression one of stubborn refusal to admit guilt. But his lies had been exposed, and his deception unraveled. He'd once boastfully told police officers, "Without a body, you can't prove anything." He was about to be catastrophically proven wrong. In February 2008, after weeks of courtroom proceedings, the jury delivered its verdict. David Hodgson was convicted of murdering Jenny Nichol. He received a life imprisonment sentence with no possibility of parole for at least 18 years. The ruling marked a landmark achievement for the British justice system, strongly affirming that a murderer could be held accountable even without key evidence. In September 2008, the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners officially recognized forensic linguistics as a specialized field, directly influenced by its instrumental role in securing Hodgson's conviction. For the Nichol family, however, this legal victory felt hollow. They'd obtained justice in court but remained without their daughter, without a burial site to mourn at, a place to leave flowers, or any physical remnant of the life so violently taken from them. In November 2009, a coroner formally declared Jenny Nichol deceased. Her death was ruled an unlawful killing, a final legal resolution to a case that, for her family, would never truly close. The story of Jenny Nichol is both heartbreaking and infuriating, a young life snuffed out by hidden, obsessive love that turned deadly. It tells of a perpetrator's ruthless and calculated deception, a web of lies that intensified a family's grief with agonizingly prolonged false hope. But it's equally a story of a subtle revolution in forensic science, a demonstration of how understated linguistic patterns can speak truth more powerfully than any denial could suppress it. David Hodgson, who presumed he'd committed a perfect nobody murder, was ultimately defeated not by one conclusive piece of evidence, but by the cumulative weight of his own lies, and by the distinctive voice of the girl he'd silenced. A voice empowered by scientific advancement to speak from beyond and identify her killer. Story 7. The Indian River, located in Brevard County, Florida, isn't actually a river. It's an estuary, a vast brackish lagoon that separates the mainland from the chain of barrier islands along the state's Atlantic coast. This area boasts peaceful natural beauty, where dolphins leap in the calm waters, and manatees drift like gentle, underwater blimps. During a Florida summer, the air is thick with the smell of salt and mangroves. It's a place where life moves at the unhurried pace of the tides. In July 2000, this serene waterway was about to reveal a horrifying truth. A story of a vibrant life violently ended, and a mystery that would take years and an almost futuristic scientific breakthrough to solve. At the center of this story was Misty April Morse. At 22, Misty seemed to embody the sunny, easygoing spirit of her coastal Florida upbringing. Originally from Ohio, she'd moved to Indian Harbor Beach with her mother, Linda, and was a beloved member of the community. Her friends described her as someone who drew people in effortlessly. A young woman with an infectious, bubbly personality who collected friends as easily as others pick up seashells along the shore. She worked as a server, her days filled with taking orders, sharing stories, and living the kind of untethered life typical of youth. By all accounts, she was a lovely, independent soul with a wide-open future ahead of her, as boundless as the Atlantic horizon. On the evening of Thursday, July 20th, 2000. Everything started normally in the cozy home she shared with her mother. Misty was getting ready to go out with friends. The small house was filled with the scent of her shampoo and the hum of her hairdryer. She was in high spirits, looking forward to an evening of music and fun. She promised her mother she'd be home by morning. A routine promise, the kind of goodbye exchanged countless times between parent and child. Her mother, Kim, left for her job at 30 a.m., leaving the house quiet as her daughter was out enjoying life. That was the last time she would see her alive. The next 2 days saw a gradual buildup of worry. At first, when Misty didn't come home, her parents weren't overly concerned. Misty was an adult with an independent streak. It wasn't completely unusual for her to stay with friends occasionally. But as hours turned into days and her phone went unanswered, their unease began to solidify into sharp dread. This felt wrong. It wasn't like Misty. Unknown to them, the first act of their ordeal had already played out. On Sunday, July 23rd, boaters on the tranquil, sun-drenched waters of the Indian River near the Merrill P. Barber Bridge in Vero Beach made a grim discovery. A body was floating in the lagoon, a pale form drifting with the gentle currents. Authorities were called, turning the peaceful water into a crime scene. The remains pulled from the warm, brackish water were severely decomposed after 3 days in Florida's heat. Facial features were swollen beyond recognition. It was a female body, naked and bound. Her wrists and ankles were tied with distinctive red and white marine rope, featuring a unique, double diamond pattern. The knots securing her were also specific. A lark's head knot, also called a cow hitch, frequently taught and used in maritime services like the Coast Guard. Her head and neck were wrapped in white duct tape. Additionally, plastic bags from Publix supermarket had been attached to weigh her down. A crude attempt to sink her and hide her secrets in the lagoon's murky depths. For investigators from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office, their first urgent task was to answer the most basic question: who was she? The body's condition ruled out visual identification, but through resourceful forensic work involving degloving, making careful cuts around her wrists to remove the skin of her hands like gloves, they were able to extract fingerprints from this preserved tissue. These prints were run through state records and quickly yielded a match. The unidentified woman from the Indian River now had a name: Misty April Morse. Her prints were on file from an earlier minor offense that now served as her final identification posthumously. The confirmation that it was Misty hit her family with crushing grief. Their agonizing uncertainty over her disappearance had been replaced by the harsh reality of her murder. With both victim and identity established, the investigation intensified. Due to the extensive decomposition, though, a definitive cause couldn't be determined by medical examiners. No fractures were present, no bullet wounds, no clear signs of injury that had survived the 3-day submersion. Could she have been strangled? Might the duct tape covering her mouth and nose have suffocated her? Was drowning the cause? Forensic science couldn't provide a definitive answer. But one fact was undeniable: this was murder. A savage and deeply personal one. The detectives now had a victim, a crime scene, and a collection of odd, specific clues. What they lacked was a perpetrator. The pursuit would lead them into the heart of Misty's life, among her friends and romantic partners, and to a man whose expertise with boats and knot tying made him a prime suspect from the start. The investigation into Misty Morse's killing began with the painstaking work of piecing together her life, her relationships, and her final moments. Officers started interviewing her friends, family, anyone who might shed light on who could have wanted to hurt this vibrant, beloved young woman. As they explored her world, one name kept surfacing: Brent Huck. At 33, Brent Huck seemed to embody a rugged, masculine ideal. He was a former Navy SEAL, a charter boat captain who made his living on the water. Handsome and confident, He'd been Misty's boyfriend until recently. Their relationship, according to friends, had been serious. They'd even lived together for a time, but it had also been tumultuous, ended with lingering, unresolved feelings. The investigators' focus on Huck intensified when they uncovered details about the crime scene. The specific marine rope, the expertly tied cow hitch knots. Everything pointed to someone with maritime experience, someone comfortable with boats. Brent Huck, the charter boat captain and ex-Navy SEAL, fit that description perfectly. The detectives visited Huck's waterfront home to question him. The house itself was a treasure trove of circumstantial evidence. In his kitchen and bedroom, they found items strikingly similar to those used in the murder. White duct tape, ordinary grocery bags, and a black rubber spline used for securing screens and windows that matched the line used to weigh down Misty's body. The coincidences were piling up, each one adding to the thickening cloud of suspicion surrounding him. Docked in the canal behind his house was his boat. Huck, compliant and seemingly untroubled, allowed the officers to search it. Inside, they found 2 long dark hairs on the deck and additional tangled hair near a fishing rod holder. They also discovered rope identical to the distinctive red and white marine cord that had bound Misty's limbs. While searching, Huck made a remark that would later be seen as a critical, self-incriminating slip. He told the investigators that there could be no reason for a woman to be tied up and thrown in the river. At that point in the investigation, the specific details of how Misty's body was found, that she'd been bound, hadn't been made public. How did he know? This was information only available to the killer and law enforcement. It was a classic tell, a slip of the tongue that detectives dream of hearing. With this accumulation of circumstantial evidence, the investigators believed they had their man, a suspect with means, expertise, and a possible, though unproven, motive stemming from a failed relationship. His suspicious statement, physical evidence from his home and boat seemingly linking him directly to the crime. They presented their case to the state attorney, confident an arrest was near. But prosecutors were cautious. They argued that while persuasive, the evidence wasn't conclusive. It was entirely circumstantial. The rope, duct tape, and plastic bags were all common household items anyone might own. The hair on the boat merely confirmed Misty had been aboard at some point, a fact not in dispute. There was no direct physical evidence unequivocally tying Brent Huck to Misty's body, no definitive piece of evidence that would compel a conviction. Prosecutors sent detectives back for more investigation. They were unwilling to proceed without certainty of conviction. For both investigators and Misty's family, it was a crushing blow. Convinced they'd identified her killer, yet he remained free due to legal standards. Their strong but circumstantial case couldn't satisfy. The investigation stalled, turning months into years, eventually growing cold. It seemed Brent Huck might escape justice, despite the suspicion, knowledge, and evidence woven tightly around him like a net around a catch. The science available in the year 2000 could take the investigation no further. A scientific revolution and a pivotal legal ruling from the opposite coast were needed to finally provide the crucial link that would bind the murderer to his deed. The breakthrough in Misty Morse's case, when it finally came, originated not from a Florida interrogation room, but from a California courtroom. In 2002, a groundbreaking ruling in a California case set a legal precedent that would forever change forensic science. For the first time, a court had allowed canine DNA to be admitted as evidence in a criminal proceeding. This was a revolutionary advance that opened an entirely new avenue for forensic investigation. For the investigators in Brevard County, this development injected a surge of hope into a case that had been dormant for 2 full years. They remembered a small, seemingly trivial detail from the original crime scene evidence, a detail that now, under this new legal precedent, took on enormous significance. Adhering to the white duct tape wrapped around Misty's head and neck, forensic analysts had discovered several strands of black hair, not human but animal, most likely from a dog. At the time, They could do nothing with it. It was a clue without a solution. But now they had the solution. The detectives also recalled another fact. During their 2000 search of Brent Huck's home, they'd met his dog, a large black canine named Sheba. With foresight that would later prove genius, they'd collected and preserved hair samples from Sheba for future comparison. A routine, though seemingly futile at the time, part of their evidence gathering. Now, armed with the new legal precedent and the preserved samples, they had a way forward. The dog hairs from the duct tape on Misty's body and the hair samples from Huck's dog Sheba were sent to a specialized laboratory on the West Coast. One of the few facilities in the world capable of conducting this cutting-edge canine DNA testing. The wait for the results was excruciating. The entire case, their 2 years of uncertainty and frustration, now rested on the microscopic genetic code of a dog duo. Weeks later, the findings came back. A perfect match. The DNA from the dog hair found on the duct tape used to restrain and suffocate Misty Morse was an exact match to the DNA of Brent Huck's dog, Sheba. This was the definitive evidence they'd sought. The direct physical scientific link connecting the murder materials straight to the prime suspect. What was once circumstantial became forensically confirmed. The everyday items, the tape and rope, were no longer just suspicious coincidences. They were part of an evidence chain leading directly to Brent Huck's doorstep. The dog, a loyal companion, had become an inadvertent, silent witness, leaving behind strands of biological evidence that would ultimately deliver its owner to justice. The investigators now formed a fresh theory of the crime, incorporating false rumors circulating about Misty at the time of her disappearance. Friends had told police of an unfounded rumor that Misty was pregnant. Investigators now suspected this rumor might have triggered the murder. They theorized that Huck, upon hearing it, confronted Misty. The encounter escalated. He strangled her in rage. Then he disposed of her body in the river, in a frantic attempt to hide his act. On October 23, 2002, over 2 years after he killed his ex-girlfriend and dumped her in the Indian River, Brent Huck was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and felony kidnapping of Misty Morse. The man whom Misty's father Bob would later call a spineless coward was finally in custody. Science and shed dog hairs had caught a killer. The long wait for justice was over at last. Brent Huck's trial in 2003 demonstrated modern forensic science's power. The prosecution presented its case against him with methodical precision. They showed jurors extensive circumstantial evidence, marine rope with distinctive knots, Publix bags, white duct tape, all items found in Huck's possession. They reminded jurors of his suspicious self-incriminating comment to police, and his knowledge of details only the perpetrator could know. But their case's cornerstone, the evidence converting suspicion into conviction, was the dog hair. They brought in forensic specialists who'd performed the canine DNA analysis and explained clearly to jurors how science linked the hairs on the duct tape to Huck's dog, Sheba. It was powerful physical evidence, directly connecting the murder tools to their user. Huck's defense attorneys tried to challenge this evidence. They argued that the evidence remained circumstantial, claiming that the dog hair only showed Misty could have encountered the dog at some time, not that Huck was responsible for her death. But the story was too detailed, the similarities too many, the forensic evidence too compelling. In the end, the jury agreed. Brent Huck was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping in the case of Misty Morse. He received 2 consecutive life sentences in a Florida prison, a punishment guaranteeing he would remain behind bars forever. Since his conviction, Brent Huck has persistently declared his innocence. He's filed appeals claiming he suffered from a flawed investigation and that the real perpetrator was another former boyfriend of Misty's, Tidy Underwood. His legal team has pushed for a new trial, presenting witnesses who testified that Underwood had a pattern of assaulting women by strangling them. However, the court system has repeatedly denied his appeals, upholding the verdict that rested on a foundation of robust scientific evidence. For Misty Morse's family, Huck's conviction offered some measure of justice, but it couldn't ease the grief of their loss. "I hope he lives forever," her father Bob said after the trial. His statement stands as a testament to enduring sorrow and a daily reminder of what he took from Misty. The Misty Morse case is a harrowing tale of a vibrant life abruptly ended, a killer who nearly escaped, and the astonishing, almost mystical capacity of forensic science to reveal truth, hidden in plain sight. It's a story showing that even the tiniest traces, like a handful of dog hairs left during an act of violence, can speak powerfully across time. A voice capable of, and indeed succeeding in, bringing a ruthless killer to account. The woman in the lagoon had finally found peace. Her story had been told. Her attacker faced consequences. Her legacy endures as an everlasting reminder of the relentless and ultimately triumphant pursuit of truth. Story 8. In the spring of 1982, the world of 16-year-old Kimberly Kim Loisel was a small, familiar landscape of school hallways, whispered conversations with her siblings, and the budding affection of a first romance. She lived in South Leon, Michigan, a quiet part of the state where life moved with the gentle, predictable rhythm of changing seasons. Kim had a poetic soul, her journals filled with verses that tried to capture the fleeting, powerful emotions of youth. By every measure, she was an ordinary teenager standing on the bright, hopeful edge of her future. Saturday, March 20th, 1982, began with the usual ease of that life. Kim had spent the day with her boyfriend. As evening began to fall, she started the journey back home, a route she'd traveled many times before. In the more relaxed, less vigilant atmosphere of the early 1980s, hitchhiking was a common, accepted way for young people to get around. A method to navigate the sprawling layout of Michigan's suburbs and countryside. Kim, like many her age, often relied on the kindness of passing drivers to reach her destinations. Her trip started at the intersection of 8 Mile and Inkster Roads, a busy crossroads marking the first leg of her route. She caught a ride that carried her further east to the corner of 8 Mile and Merriman Roads in Livonia. It was now roughly 6:30 p.m. The sky beginning to darken with sunset colors. She was still several miles from home, with the final crucial segment of her journey ahead. From a payphone at a gas station, she called her mother, Joan. Her voice was a familiar comfort as she told her she was heading home. She then made at least 4 more calls, reaching out to friends in South Leon, trying to arrange a ride for the last part of her trip. Each call was a small act of hope cast into the twilight, seeking someone to escort her home. But no ride came through. The friends she reached were busy, their Saturday night plans already set. With all options exhausted, Kim stepped away from the relative safety of the payphone and returned to the roadside. Her thumb extended, her eyes on approaching vehicles driven by strangers. This was the last time anyone saw her alive. As night deepened and car headlights grew fewer, Kim Loisel disappeared into Michigan's coldly indifferent highway darkness. The silence that followed Kim's final phone call at first seemed normal. But as time passed, and it became clear she should have been home long before, that silence grew ominous. Her mother Joanne waited anxiously by the phone as worry intensified within her. By Sunday morning, March 21st, that worry had transformed into full, terrifying alarm. Kim had vanished entirely, upending their family's life. They began frantic, sorrowful efforts to track down someone who seemed like a ghost. They called everyone possible, friends, her boyfriend, anyone who might have seen her or known anything about where she could be. But Every inquiry resulted in nothing. No one had witnessed anything after seeing Kim standing alone beside Merriman Road, hoping for help. That very day, they went to the Green Oak Township Police Department to report someone missing. But their urgent pleas met with frustratingly calm, almost indifferent responses. Police, accustomed to handling turbulent teenage lives, interpreted events differently. A 16-year-old girl not coming home on a Saturday night seemed straightforward. She must have run away. Joanne vehemently opposed this theory with all her conviction. She wasn't running away. She'd been coming home. She told me so herself, Joan would later remember. Her voice still pained recalling that awful, frustrating day. But authorities stuck to their hypothesis, delaying the critical investigative urgency needed for potential kidnapping cases. Weeks passed. The family continued their desperate quest alone, papering neighborhoods with posters showing Kim's cheerful face, tracking down acquaintances, retracing her movements, hunting for any hint, any faint lead that might reveal something. Still, nothing emerged. It seemed she'd simply vanished from existence. Then, on April 14th, 1982, almost 4 weeks after her disappearance, the agonizing uncertainty ended horrifically. Kim's remains were found, discovered in wooded, isolated grounds behind a park-and-ride facility at Island Lake Recreation Area, a natural sanctuary perverted into a site of unspeakable tragedy, just 5 miles from the safety of home. Investigators encountered a scene displaying extreme, vicious brutality. She was found unclothed, her belongings missing, sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. But the autopsy findings introduced an even more disturbing dimension. The medical examiner concluded that despite being missing for over 3 weeks, Kim had died only 4 or 5 days before being found. The realization was overwhelming. She hadn't died the night she disappeared. For weeks, she'd remained in captivity, held by her kidnapper. Kimberly had endured repeated sexual assaults, physical beatings, and attempts to suffocate her throughout a span of unimaginable horror. The original theory of a teenage runaway had given way to the harsh truth of an abduction, an extended period of torment, and a murder. Law enforcement now faced a murder investigation, one without eyewitnesses, suspects, and with an assailant who had disappeared as completely as Kim had on that cold March evening. The investigation was cold before it could properly begin. The ghost of Island Lake had taken its first life, but more would follow. For 4 decades, the Kimberly Louisville investigation existed as a phantom file, a frozen, silent record within the Michigan State Police Archives. The early investigation had produced no significant leads, no persons of interest, no resolution. Life moved on for others. Kim's friends matured. Her siblings built their own families. But for her relatives, the pain never faded. The uncertainty persisted as a constant, gnawing sorrow, an unanswered question that hung over their lives, casting a long and terrible shadow. But one person was determined not to accept the silence. Kim's younger sister, Cindy Arthur, dedicated her life to finding her sister's murderer. As time passed and the official investigation stagnated, Cindy became an investigator herself, an unyielding pursuer of a truth that seemed intent on staying hidden. About 15 years after the murder, she began her mission in earnest, searching online for her sister's name, only to find several outdated, inaccurate news articles. It felt like she'd never existed, Cindy remembered, the frustration still clear in her voice. That became my starting point because I wanted to fix the wrong information. And from that moment, it just grew. She created a Facebook page, a digital hub for information, a place to share memories, and a beacon of hope. Throughout the long, dark night of the unsolved mystery, she found her sister's former friends, assembling a fuller picture of Kim's life, her world, her final moments. She remained a steady, determined force, an advocate for the sister whose voice had been silenced a thorn in the side of a system that had let the case go cold for too long. Then, in the summer of 2022, a new team examined the old case files. As part of a distinctive and novel initiative, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit partnered with students from Michigan State University's School of Criminal Justice. These students, young, bright, and equipped with fresh perspectives, were assigned the massive task of sorting through boxes of old evidence and aging documents, the fading photographs of a crime committed before many of them were even born. As they explored the records, one name caught their attention, a name that had been buried in the files for decades. It came from an old tip dating back to 1983. Someone had called law enforcement to express their suspicions about a man named Charles David Shaw. The informant said that Shaw lived in Kim's neighborhood and that he'd recently demolished his house, an action they found highly suspicious. The officers had documented it, but for reasons lost to time's haze, they never pursued Shaw further. To these MSU students, this represented more than just a neglected tip. It was a thread they were committed to pulling. Simultaneously, just miles away, another cold case team was pulling on their own thread, one destined to intersect with the Louisville investigation in an unexpected way. The Livingston County Sheriff's Office cold case team was reviewing the 1983 killing of another young woman, 19-year-old Christina Castiglione, who went missing on March 19, 1983, almost exactly 1 year after Kim Louisville's abduction. Like Kim, she was walking beside a road in Redford Township when she vanished. Her remains were found 10 days later in a state wildlife area. She too had been strangled and sexually assaulted. During her autopsy, detectives collected DNA evidence. But in the pre-DNA era, it was evidence without context, preserved, entered into CODIS nationally in the early 2000s, but never matched with anyone. In March 2022, Livingston County detectives obtained funding from Season of Justice, a nonprofit providing resources for advanced DNA analysis in cold cases. They sent genetic material from Christina's remains to Othram, a specialized Texas lab focusing on forensic genealogy using cutting-edge techniques. Othram's experts built ancestral profiles from the old DNA, uploaded them to public genealogy platforms, and began the meticulous work of building family trees, hunting for the unknown killer's relatives. Their investigation led them toward Charles David Shaw's family. With his family's help, offering their DNA for comparison, investigators confirmed indisputably Charles David Shaw murdered Christina Castiglione. The ghost was identified. This revelation was a breakthrough. A 4-decade-old mystery was finally unraveled. But the story didn't end there. Upon hearing the name Charles David Shaw, the Michigan State University students working on the Kim Louisville investigation felt a jolt of energy. It matched the name from the neglected 1983 tip. The two separate, concurrent investigations had converged at one alarming point. Focus on Shaw as the prime suspect in Kim Louisville's murder sharpened. Authorities began tracing his life, documenting his addresses and job sites. They found that his documented whereabouts created an eerie pattern circling the area where Kim was abducted and where her remains were discovered. Armed with this compelling new direction, the team revisited the evidence from Kim's case, the boxes that had been stored away for 40 years. The MSU students and law enforcement officers performed a thorough review and sent the materials to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab for reanalysis with modern techniques that were inconceivable in 1982. They were hoping for a miracle, for one tiny clue that had been overlooked. Several months later, they got it. Among the decades-old evidence, a single sperm cell was detected. It was an extremely rare find, a biological rarity lost in the vastness of years. DNA from that lone cell was isolated and entered into the database. It matched exactly with Charles David Shaw's DNA. After 41 years of silence, of futile searches, of painful uncertainty, The truth was finally revealed. Charles David Shaw was the man who had kidnapped, imprisoned, and killed 16-year-old Kimberly Luisel. Law enforcement was now completely certain they had identified the perpetrator. But closing the case brought mixed emotions. A triumph for technology and persistence that felt hollow because of the time that had passed. Charles David Shaw would never stand trial for his crimes. He would never answer for his actions in a court of law. On November 27, 1983, shortly after he murdered Christina Castiglione, he was found dead in his Detroit home. His death was ruled accidental, caused by autoerotic asphyxiation. The monster had died not by justice's hand, but by his own during a sordid, solitary act. Identifying Charles David Shaw as a double murderer has prompted investigators to suspect he might have been a serial killer, that there could be additional victims, other unsolved cases bearing his sinister mark. They're currently examining unsolved crimes from the early 1970s up to his death in 1983, hunting for his trace in other neglected files. For Kimberly Luisel's family, the announcement brought a complicated and profound sense of closure. The question of who had been answered. The person who had taken their daughter, sister, and friend finally had a name and a face. But it was a form of justice without its ultimate satisfying chapter. "It's a name," Cindy Arthur said, her statement reflecting the arduous journey she'd endured. "And that's more than we had yesterday." The Kimberly Luisel case tells the story of evil hidden in everyday life, of a killer who moved through society undetected, leaving destruction in his wake. But it's equally a story of a flame that wouldn't be extinguished. It's the chronicle of a sister's unwavering devotion, of dedicated students who revived an abandoned investigation, and of science's remarkable ability to reach through time and pull a name from darkness. The ghost of Island Lake has finally been named, but the memory of the two young women whose lives he so cruelly ended will always remain embedded in Michigan's landscape. A sad and lasting symbol of justice's long, slow, but ultimately unyielding march. Story 9. The humid night air in Roppongi was thick and oppressive. A dense blend of neon lights, expensive perfumes, and the lingering smell of stale tobacco. This was a district that never fully slept, a labyrinth of steel and stone where desires were bought and sold under the constant gaze of countless flickering advertisements. In this pulsing heart of Tokyo's nightlife, fortunes were both made and lost. Secrets were traded in dimly lit corners, and when conflict arose, it was swift and merciless. On September 2, 2012, the city's usual rhythm continued. Office workers, with their ties loosened and inhibitions shed, wandered between glowing drinking establishments. Girls in dangerously high heels giggled as they navigated crowded streets, their faces lit by their phone screens. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a separate world operated, one ruled by its own laws, its own brutal code. This was the realm of the Bosozoku, the biker gangs that had menaced Japan's roads for years, and their more evolved, more dangerous successors. At the peak of this hidden hierarchy stood a figure known as the King of Violence. His birth name was Shinichi Meitat, but it was rarely spoken aloud. He led Kanto Rengo, a group that had transformed from a loose alliance of suburban bike troublemakers into a powerful criminal organization. Meitat defied the usual gangster stereotype. He had a solid build but wasn't imposing, standing only 167 centimeters tall. His face, later displayed on wanted posters nationwide, seemed ordinary at first, but his eyes, dark and penetrating, conveyed a cold emptiness that hinted at a capacity for severe brutality. Meitat's reputation traveled ahead of him. He was known for his lavish lifestyle, including a high-end apartment he shared with his German wife and their child. But behind this veneer of refinement existed a savage viciousness. He was notorious for beating his enemies nearly to death, a cruel tendency that had earned him his title. Under his command, Kanto Rengo had grown into a force to be reckoned with, their reach extending from the poorly lit karaoke rooms of Shinjuku to the upscale nightclubs of Roppongi. That evening, a piece of information had reached Meitate. A whisper on the wind that one of his rivals, a member of the hated Kimura Kai, was partying in Roppongi. The Kimura brothers, Kojiro and Tario, were criminals with whom Kanto Rengo shared a long and violent history. Just hearing their name was enough to ignite Meitate's rage. Revenge in his world wasn't something to be delayed. It was a burning, all-consuming fever that demanded immediate satisfaction. The target was reportedly at Studio Flower, a popular nightclub in the Roppongi 5-Chome area. The venue was a multi-story maze of dance floors, VIP sections, and dark corners. A perfect place for someone to lose themselves in the pleasure-seeking grip of the night. It was also a perfect setting for an ambush. Meitate gathered his crew, 11 of his most trusted accomplices. They were a rough collection of thugs and enforcers, their loyalty to Meitate unquestioning. They collected their weapons of choice, metal baseball bats, cool and heavy in their hands. They put on black face coverings, becoming an anonymous, menacing unit. The plan was straightforward. Storm the club, find the Kimura brother, and beat him to death in front of his friends. It was a statement, a brutal declaration of Kanto Rengo's dominance. The city, unaware of the impending chaos, carried on with its evening festivities. Inside Studio Flower, the music pounded, a relentless rhythm that reverberated through the floor and into the dancers' bodies. In the private VIP area, a circle of friends celebrated, their laughter and conversation drowned out by the club's noise. Among them sat Ryosuke Fujimoto, a 31-year-old restaurant manager. He was a man with a promising future, someone unconnected to the criminal underworld, a person who, by a cruel twist of fate, closely resembled one of the Kimura brothers. At exactly 3:43 a.m., Studio Flower's doors burst open. The sudden rush of cold night air and the sight of 12 masked men wielding baseball bats triggered a wave of panic throughout the club. The music cut off abruptly, replaced by screams from patrons. The previously festive atmosphere dissolved into primal fear. The masked men moved forward with frightening precision, their eyes scanning the VIP section. They spotted Fujimoto sitting among his friends, sealing his fate in that instant. Their resemblance was enough. In the club's dim, strobing light, amid the adrenaline-fueled confusion, he looked like their target. The attack unfolded as a whirlwind of motion and violence. The henchmen converged on Fujimoto, striking him repeatedly with their bats. His friends watched, paralyzed, unable to help. The clang of metal hitting flesh and bone echoed in the now silent club, a sickening rhythm that would haunt those who heard it forever. The assault was relentless, a furious outburst of rage that allowed no room for mercy. When it stopped, Fujimoto lay motionless on the ground, his body shattered and bruised. The masked men, having completed their grim task, vanished into the night, leaving behind a landscape of devastation and lasting psychological scars. The scene that followed was a chaotic display of flashing emergency lights, rushed paramedics, and shocked, weeping witnesses. Law enforcement arrived to face a picture of extreme cruelty. The VIP section, previously a haven of privilege and enjoyment, had been transformed into a place of carnage. Fujimoto was rushed to the hospital, but efforts were futile. He was declared dead, the victim of a vicious attack that was as pointless as it was brutal. As the first wave of shock began to fade, the investigation started. Officers quickly reconstructed the evening's events. Their focus zeroed in on Kanto Rengo and its magnetic, sociopathic leader. Meitate's name became the subject of every conversation, his history of violence marking him as the prime person of interest. The motive seemed straightforward. A typical gang conflict? A territorial dispute carried out with baseball bats in Tokyo's heart. But as detectives probed deeper, a terrifying truth began to emerge. Ryosuke Fujimoto wasn't involved in gang activity. He had no ties to the Kimura-kai or any role in criminal enterprises. He was an innocent man, a hard-working restaurant manager who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. A man who paid the ultimate price for resembling someone else. This discovery sparked a fresh surge of shock and fury across the city. This wasn't just criminals killing criminals. It was the murder of an innocent civilian. A random act of violence that destroyed the sense of safety many Tokyo residents cherished. The press seized the story, the poignant twist in Fujimoto's death providing a gripping and emotive narrative. He became a symbol of the senselessness of gang violence. In photos shared by his grieving family, his face beamed with life, a sharp contrast from the brutal reality of his end. The pressure on law enforcement to solve the case was tremendous. Citizens demanded revenge. Journalists pressed for answers. And the government, eager to calm mounting public anxiety, vowed that those responsible would face consequences. The hunt for Shinichi Meitate and his associates began. But Meitate was cunning. He anticipated the law closing in, knowing that Japan's legal machinery was ready to target him. He was slippery, a ghost within the system with no plans for capture. As his underlings were arrested one by one, Meitate ran. 1 week after the murder, on September 9th, 2012, he caught a flight to Beijing, the first leg of a frantic quest to avoid punishment. From China, he traveled to Seoul, South Korea. His movements were a carefully planned ruse to mislead investigators. 2 months later, in early November, he appeared in Jakarta, Indonesia, eventually reaching the Philippines. The Philippines, with its vast island chain, crowded urban centers, and notoriously porous borders, offered an ideal hideout for someone like Meitate. He dissolved into Manila's intricate alleyways, a phantom among millions. The trail went cold. Back in Japan, the investigation continued, but without its mastermind, the proceedings felt incomplete. Meitate's associates were arrested and prosecuted, their testimonies revealing a disturbing glimpse into Count Arengo's operations and Meitate's total control over his crew. But without the architect of the violence, justice seemed partial. Japanese authorities, in partnership with Interpol, issued a red notice for Meitate's capture, placing his face among globally wanted criminals. A bounty reaching 3 million yen was offered for tips leading to his arrest, a last-ditch effort to persuade someone to break the code of silence protecting him. Time passed. Seasons changed. Roppongi's neon signs kept glowing and public memory of Ryosuke Fujimoto's killing gradually dimmed. But for investigators and Fujimoto's family, the case stayed open, a wound that wouldn't heal. The thought of Meitate free, enjoying a life he'd cruelly taken from another, was unbearable. Detective work in the Philippines proved dishearteningly fruitless. Tips would surface. Rumors of a Japanese fugitive living in a Manila condo in the Malad district, a man altered by plastic surgery. Philippine forces would raid the location, hopes rising, only to find nothing. The fugitive always stayed just out of reach, a shadow who left no trace. Whispers suggested that Meitate had found refuge on the island of Cebu, with its dense jungles and isolated villages offering perfect cover for someone evading capture. But these leads ultimately went nowhere. The intelligence was a tangle of truth and lies, mixing real sightings with deliberately planted false information. It appeared that Meitate had powerful allies, people willing to shield him from the scrutiny of authorities. As a decade passed, the investigation lost steam. The wanted posters, once common fixtures in police stations and public buildings throughout Japan, began to fade, their edges yellowing and curling with time. The bounty went unclaimed. Meitate had become a ghost, a shadowy figure lurking at the edges of the criminal underworld. His name became synonymous with a crime that shocked a nation and a legal resolution that was never achieved. To rekindle public interest and uncover fresh leads, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department released updated digitally altered portraits of Maytate in 2024, speculating on his possible appearance after more than a decade in hiding. The images of a man who might be heavier, thinner, or aged served as a somber reflection on time's passage and the years Maytate had stolen from his victim and from the pursuit of justice. The unveiling of these images did trigger a surge of new reports, totaling over 1,000, but every single one led nowhere. The person in the pictures was always someone else, a case of mistaken identity that mirrored the tragic irony of Fujimoto's death. The Shinichi Maytate saga is the story of a man who thrived on violence and has thus far escaped its fatal consequences. It's a tale about an undercurrent of brutality hidden within one of the world's most orderly societies. And it's the story of a family's endless grief and the quest for justice that remains frustratingly out of reach. Somewhere across the globe, perhaps in Manila's bustling streets or in a remote village in the Philippine countryside, Shinichi Maytate remains at large. He's a man without a country or identity, a ghost constantly looking over his shoulder. The king of violence may have fled his kingdom, but he can never outrun the shadow cast by his crime. The ghost of Roppongi still walks free, and the search for him continues. Story 10. In the quiet, flat landscape of Delmarva, a region that straddles the border of Delaware and Maryland, life moves with a calm, predictable rhythm. It's a place of small, close-knit communities, where the changing seasons are marked by the harvesting of corn and soybeans, and the breeze carries a faint, salty scent from the nearby Atlantic. Here, family roots run deep, and life can feel small, safe, and enclosed. In the fall of 2010, this was the world of Whitney Lynn Bennett. At 23 years old, she was a young woman immersed in the beautiful, chaotic, and often exhausting duties of motherhood. Whitney was a daughter to her parents, a friend to many, but most importantly, she was a mom to 3 wonderful children, 2 boys named Brian and Alia, and a girl named Jala. Her daily life was a complex rhythm shaped by their needs. The school drop-offs and pickups, the small scrapes from play, the bedtime stories, the endless love that defined her world. She was devoted to her home. Her universe revolved around the modest house on Susan Beach Road, a place she hoped to make a haven for her little ones. By all accounts, she was a caring mother, a young woman who found her greatest joy and purpose in her children despite life's challenges. But there was a shadow hanging over this picture of young motherhood, a source of instability and stress that was always present in her life. His name was William A. Hill. He was Whitney's on and off boyfriend, a man whose background involved repeated run-ins with the law. Their relationship was volatile, a repeating cycle of breakups and reconciliations, a turbulent push and pull of affection and conflict. For Whitney's family, especially her mother Robin, William represented constant worry. They saw the chaos he brought into their daughter's life, the turmoil that always seemed to follow him. They wanted better for her and their grandchildren. But Whitney, caught in the powerful and confusing currents of a difficult relationship, kept going back to him. As the holiday season approached in late 2010, the air turned crisp and early hints of winter descended on the Delmarva Peninsula. Whitney was navigating the familiar complexities of her routine, managing her household, caring for her children, and dealing with the constant upheaval from her connection with William Hill. She was a young woman with a bright smile and a caring heart, someone loved by many. She had no idea she was standing at the edge of a vast and terrible darkness, that the familiar shadow long hovering at the edge of her life was about to merge into an overwhelming force that would consume her entirely. leaving behind a void so deep it would take years to fully understand. On Saturday, December 4th, 2010, Whitney Bennett was last seen alive. She was in Wicomico County, Maryland, the neighboring county to her Delaware home. The exact details of her final known moments remain obscured by time's fog and the silence of those who know the truth. But it's established that after that date, she disappeared. The first days after her vanishing didn't immediately trigger alarm on the surface. The unstable nature of her relationship with William Hill meant that her movements could sometimes be unpredictable. But as time went by without contact, a chilling dread began to seep into her family's hearts. Whitney's life revolved around her children. It was inconceivable that she would choose to leave them, that she wouldn't call or reach out to them or be there for their nightly routines. The silence from her phone, the unreturned messages dissolving into electronic emptiness, became an alarming rhythm, signaling something was terribly wrong. On Thursday, December 9th, 5 days after her last sighting, her mother, Robin, could no longer bear the torturous uncertainty. She went to the Delaware State Police to report Whitney as missing. The initial response from authorities was cautious, shaped by practical experience handling complicated situations involving young adults' lives. A 23-year-old with a stormy romantic history, it resembled stories they'd encountered before. At first, local law enforcement didn't assume criminal involvement. It was approached as a routine missing persons matter with an underlying unspoken expectation that she might turn up shortly. A disagreement with her boyfriend resolved this brief, mysterious gap, just a temporary interruption in life's flow. But those close to Whitney knew better. This wasn't about romantic conflict or needing space. This was an anomaly, a break from who she fundamentally was. It was as though one day she walked away without ever intending to come back home. As one case analyst later noted, those who loved Whitney sensed something must have gone terribly wrong. That feeling settled over them like a funeral shroud, transforming what should have been celebratory holidays into a time filled with darkness. The search for Whitney Bennett had begun, a quest that would stretch across the cold winter months and into the first tentative moments of spring. A search that would lead them and the detectives, who had finally started to mirror their sense of urgent concern, to a remote wooded property and a shallow, hastily dug burial site. For 4 long, painful months, the Bennett family's existence hung in a state of limbo. Winter draped the eastern shore in a cold, overcast light that mirrored the despair in their hearts. Each morning they woke with one desperate question: where is Whitney? And each night they went to bed with that question unanswered, the lack of answers a torture more severe than any certainty. The Wicomico County Bureau of Investigation, having taken over the case because of Whitney's last confirmed location, began the slow, systematic work of trying to track a ghost. They interviewed friends and family, building a portrait of her life, her relationships, her routines. And at the center of that portrait, looming large and ominous, was William Hill. He emerged as a figure of interest from the start. His history, his volatile connection with Whitney, his proximity to her in the time just before she vanished, all signs pointed toward him. But pointing to guilt and proving it are different things. There was no physical evidence, no crime scene, no body. There was only a missing woman and a man surrounded by a cloud of suspicion. As it turned out, William Hill wasn't free. During Whitney's disappearance, he was already facing legal troubles of his own, locked up in the Wicomico County Detention Center on separate charges of assault. His incarceration both hindered and streamlined the investigation. It meant he posed no immediate, ongoing threat to the public, but it also meant he was in a controlled environment, surrounded by fellow inmates, his conversations and actions limited. He was both a captive audience and a confined person of interest. While the investigation into Whitney's disappearance continued, the winter of 2010 turned into the spring of 2011. The ice melted, the ground softened, and the first green shoots of new life began to emerge from the frozen earth. For the Bennett family, the change of seasons offered no comfort, just a deepening sense of dread. The hope that Whitney might still be alive, that she might somehow come home, was beginning to fade. Then in April, the breakthrough came. It didn't come from persistent detective work, or a lucky roadside stop, or a sudden pang of conscience from an informant. It arrived as a whisper, a secret shared from an unknown source to the authorities. An anonymous tip was provided, a voice from the shadows directing the detectives to a specific location, a large vacant property in rural Somerset County, just south of Wicomico. The tip was eerily detailed. It told them where to look. It told them they would find a body. Armed with this information and a legal warrant for search, a team of investigators and forensic specialists converged on the several acres of isolated woodland. The search was methodical and somber. They moved among the trees, their eyes scanning the ground for any disturbance or sign that the earth had been freshly turned. And then they saw it. A place where things looked wrong. A crude grave. They began to dig. With each shovelful of soil removed, the terrible accuracy of the anonymous tip was confirmed. They uncovered a female body. It was Whitney. After 4 months of agonizing uncertainty, the search was over. But finding her remains only opened another chapter in their grief, one even more terrifying than before. Their daughter, their mother, their friend hadn't simply gone missing. She'd been murdered, and her body abandoned in a shallow tomb, left exposed to nature's callous indifference to human tragedy. The discovery instantly changed this case. What had been treated as someone missing became unmistakably recognized as a murderous act. However, due to the condition of the body after being buried for such a duration, forensic experts faced major obstacles determining the exact cause of death. Clear marks like bullet holes or severe injuries hadn't survived the decay process, so officially the cause remained inconclusive. A frustrating outcome, medically speaking, that contradicted the obvious truth about a young woman hidden away and secretly buried. But investigators saw this as more of a legal barrier than a practical one, because they were convinced a homicide had occurred and were increasingly certain of the perpetrator's identity. The anonymous tip was seen as a crack in the silence surrounding William Hill's secret concerning Whitney's fate, a burden too heavy to bear alone. Finally, someone had succumbed to the pressure, revealing it. The investigation's focus sharpened with near surgical precision on the man already confined in a jail cell, the person central to Whitney's turbulent life, and the one authorities were now certain was central to her death. The answer to the mystery of Whitney Bennett's murder didn't lie in a fingerprint, a DNA trace, or any overlooked physical clue. It emerged from the hushed conversations and hidden truths within the Wicomico County Detention Center, a place where information serves as valuable currency, and a strategically shared confession can secure a person's freedom. With William Hill already locked up on separate charges, the detectives had a suspect under lock and key. They also had a ready-made audience of listeners. They knew that in the high-pressure world of incarceration, secrets tend to leak out. All they needed was patience. The breakthrough came through an informant, another inmate who had gained William Hill's trust. This source, whose identity was protected for safety reasons, approached the authorities with a story that was both shocking and eerily believable. According to the informant, William Hill, during an unguarded moment of disclosure, had confessed to killing Whitney, but he hadn't acted alone. He had help. He told the informant that he and his father, Claude H. Hill, had taken Whitney's life and buried her in the woods. This was a remarkable development. A confession that not only implicated William Hill, but also widened the circle of complicity to include his own father. The story clarified numerous questions: the disappearance, the discovery of the body in a shallow grave, and the subsequent cold silence. The investigators now had a narrative, a theory of the crime backed by an outright confession, the one given to a jailhouse informant, a source whose credibility would surely be challenged in court. But the informant's story continued with an even stranger and more disturbing dimension to the plot. A second source came forward, this one providing details about William Hill's stepbrother, Stephen L. Acers. According to this informant, Acers had been recruited to help cover up the crime afterward. His alleged role was as grim as it was bold. He'd helped place 2 cameras at the burial location, a surveillance system designed to monitor the area around Whitney's makeshift grave. The implications of this disclosure were profound. It suggested a crime that wasn't just an impulsive burst of violence, but a premeditated killing followed by an equally calculated effort to conceal it. The idea of positioning cameras to watch over a victim's resting place revealed a level of paranoia and wickedness that was difficult to comprehend. Were they watching to make sure the body stayed undiscovered? Were they tracking law enforcement activity? Or was it something more twisted, a desire to maintain a morbid remote control over their victim's final burial place? Armed with the informant's account, the investigators now had a clear direction to pursue. The scattered pieces of evidence, long disconnected and fragmented, were finally coming together into a unified and terrifying picture. They had motive, a volatile and abusive relationship that ended fatally. They had means, a secret killing. They had location, the remote woodland area in Somerset County. And now they had accomplices, a son, father, and stepbrother, bound not by family love, but by participation in murderous secrecy. In April 2011, shortly after Whitney's remains were located, law enforcement took action. They charged Claude H. Hill, the father, and his stepson, Stephen L. Acers, with being accessories after the fact and obstruction of justice. A week later, they brought the most serious charges against the central figure. William A. Hill was indicted for first and second-degree murder in Whitney Bennett's death. The indictment sent shockwaves through the local community. The disappearance that had troubled the area for months had found some resolution, but it was as dreadful as the original act. A young mother allegedly killed by someone who was supposed to love her, who then involved his own family in hiding his heinous deed. The long silence surrounding this case had been maintained by family collusion, a pact broken only by one whispered confession within county jail walls. The battle for legal justice for Whitney Bennett was ready to begin. The judicial process against William Hill and his relatives proved lengthy and complex, a journey through a justice system that moves at a measured pace. For the Bennett family, it represented another phase of excruciating waiting, a purgatory between confronting the horrors of the past and awaiting final legal reckoning. The prosecution's case against William Hill rested almost entirely on testimony from within prison walls, provided by an informant's word alone. This posed a considerable challenge for the prosecution. The defense was certain to question the informant's credibility, painting him as a self-serving individual, fabricating a story to secure a reduced sentence for his own legal troubles. The autopsy findings' failure to pinpoint a precise cause of death added another substantial hurdle. Without a clear explanation for Whitney's death, the prosecution would need to rely on the strength of circumstantial evidence and the disturbing account of the confession. The legal proceedings involving Claude Hill and Stephen Acers were even more intricate, hinging on subtle legal definitions of complicity in a crime. Were they aware of the killing? And if so, how did they help hide it? The story of the surveillance cameras in the woods, if proven, would serve as powerful evidence, an unmistakable act of obstructing justice. As the legal processes moved through preliminary stages, the full heartbreaking scope of Whitney's ordeal was revealed. She was more than just a name in court papers, more than simply a victim. She was a mother whose 3 children were now growing up in her absence, their lives permanently altered by one violent act. The courtroom proceedings served as an ongoing distressing reminder of the personal toll exacted by the crime, the widespread impact of one death that had shattered both a family and a community. In the end, the case's resolution didn't unfold in a sensational public trial. It came, as often happens, within the quiet realm of plea negotiations. The specifics of the final legal outcomes received less publicity than the shocking elements of the crime. However, it's understood that justice, in its imperfect legal form, was sought. William Hill, the man at the center of the chaos, faced consequences for his role in the death of the woman he claimed to care for. The story of Whitney Bennett stands as a sad and cautionary tale. It's a story about hidden dangers in intimate partner violence, about how an unstable relationship can escalate into a deadly one. It's a story about family involvement in wrongdoing, about a bond that was twisted to hide a murder instead of supporting a person's well-being. And it's a story about justice's slow, often frustrating, yet persistent nature. In the end, it wasn't scientific analysis or a brilliant investigative breakthrough that solved the case. It was a person's utterance, a whisper within a jail cell, a hidden truth that grew too heavy to keep. That utterance gave Whitney's family what they'd been denied for 4 long months: a resolution. It was a terrible resolution, but it was one nonetheless. It returned Whitney to her family and set in motion the mechanism that would prevent those responsible for silencing her voice from escaping punishment. Their terrible secret remains forever trapped in their own imposed silence. The quiet of Susan Beach Road was finally and irreversibly broken.